Chapter 5, Unit 5, Impact of Computing. 5.1 Beneficial and Harmful Effects. Let's talk about something that might seem obvious at first glance, but turns out to be one of the most nuanced topics on the AP CSP exam. The idea that computing innovations are almost never purely good or purely bad. They're both simultaneously, and the College Board wants you to be able to articulate why with real precision. The double-edged sword of innovation. Imagine you're holding a kitchen knife. In the hands of a chef, it creates a beautiful meal. In the wrong circumstances, it causes harm. Computing innovations work exactly the same way, and the AP exam is going to test whether you understand that duality. The College Board's key framing here is this: a computing innovation can be intentional or unintentional in its effects, and those effects can be beneficial or harmful, and critically, the same innovation can be all four things at once depending on context and perspective. Take social media as your anchor example throughout this topic. When platforms like Facebook and Twitter were designed, their intended purpose was connection, reuniting old friends, sharing news, organizing communities. That was the intentional beneficial effect. But alongside it came intentional harmful potential too, because every designer knew that a public platform could spread misinformation. Then there are the effects nobody fully predicted: the psychological impact on adolescent self-esteem, the way algorithmic feeds can radicalize users, or conversely, how social media became a lifeline for isolated individuals during a global pandemic. Those unintended consequences, both the harmful and the surprising good ones, are exactly what the AP exam wants you to recognize and categorize. The four-quadrant framework you need to master. Here's a mental model that will serve you extremely well on both the multiple choice and free response sections. Think of a 2x2 grid in your head. One axis runs from intended to unintended. The other axis runs from beneficial to harmful. Every effect of every computing innovation you encounter on this exam can be placed somewhere in that grid, intended and beneficial. GPS navigation was designed to help people find their way, and it does exactly that. Intended and harmful. A company that deliberately harvests and sells your personal data without disclosure, harmful by design. Unintended and beneficial. The internet was built for military communication redundancy, but it created the entire digital economy as a happy accident. Unintended and harmful. Smartphones were designed to connect people, but researchers have documented significant increases in teen anxiety and sleep disruption that nobody planned for. The exam will frequently present you with a scenario and ask you to identify the type of effect being described. Don't rush. Read carefully whether the effect was something designers anticipated and whether it's positive or negative for the people experiencing it. Tradeoffs are not optional knowledge. One of the biggest traps on the AP exam is assuming that identifying a harmful effect means rejecting the technology. That's not how the College Board thinks about this. The exam expects you to demonstrate understanding of tradeoffs. The idea that adopting an innovation means accepting a package deal of benefits and costs. Precision agriculture uses sensors and data analytics to dramatically reduce water and pesticide usage, which is a clear environmental benefit. But it also concentrates agricultural power in the hands of tech companies and requires farmers to share sensitive data about their land and yields. Neither side cancels the other out. A student who writes, "Precision agriculture is good because it saves water," on an FRQ is leaving serious points on the table. The student who earns full credit explains the benefit and names the realistic trade-off. When you see the phrase, "which of the following describes a potential harmful effect," paired with an obviously beneficial technology, the College Board is not trying to trick you into hating the technology. They're testing whether you can hold complexity in your head. The answer is almost always the one that describes an unintended consequence or a real cost borne by a specific group of people. Connecting to other units. This doesn't live in a silo. Section 5.1 is the doorway into the entire impact of computing unit, and it connects backward to nearly everything you've studied before. When you studied algorithms in Unit 3, you were really studying tools that create effects in the world. When you studied data in Unit 2, you are studying a resource whose collection, storage, and use has profound human consequences. The College Board designed the curriculum so that the question, "What does this technology do?" always echoes with a second question, "What does this technology do to people?" You'll also need to connect this topic forward to 5.2 on digital divide issues, 5.3 on computing bias, and 5.4 on crowdsourcing. In each of those sections, the beneficial versus harmful framework you're building right now is the foundation. If a computing system advantages some populations and disadvantages others, that is simultaneously a beneficial effect for one group and a potentially harmful effect for another, and the exam absolutely loves to test that perspective-dependent framing. What the FRQ rubric actually rewards. Free response questions on this topic typically ask you to describe a beneficial effect and describe a harmful effect of a given innovation, and they specifically require that you explain the mechanism, not just label the effect. Saying GPS can be harmful because of privacy earns you nothing. Saying GPS continuously logs location data, which could be accessed by bad actors or used by companies to build behavioral profiles without users' explicit awareness, earns the point. The rubric wants causality. This happens. Therefore, that harm or benefit results. A critical edge case to watch for. The College Board distinguishes between effects on individuals, effects on society, and effects on the world. If a question asks for a societal effect and you describe something that only happens to one person, you're likely losing that point. Scale matters in how you frame your answer. The human factor and moral responsibility. One last concept that surprises students. The AP exam holds that computing innovators have a responsibility to consider the potential impacts of their work before releasing it. This isn't about blame after the fact, it's about proactive consideration. When a company deploys a recommendation algorithm without studying its potential to amplify extreme content, the College Board frames that as a failure of responsible innovation, not just bad luck. Think of it like a pharmaceutical company. They test for side effects before a drug hits the market, and we expect them to. The same ethical expectation, the AP curriculum argues, applies to software and computing systems. This framing will help you on questions that ask whether a developer should have anticipated a harmful consequence. The answer, almost always, is yes. As you carry this framework into the next section, you'll see how these beneficial and harmful effects play out along lines of access and equity, because it turns out that who gets the benefits and who bears the harms of computing is rarely distributed evenly across society. 5.2 Digital Divide. What is the digital divide, and why does it matter? Imagine two students sitting down to complete the same homework assignment. One student has a brand new laptop, a fast home Wi-Fi connection, and a quiet room to work in. The other student has to walk to the public library, wait for an open computer, and rush through the work before the library closes. Both students are equally intelligent, equally motivated, but they are not starting from the same line. That gap right there is the digital divide in miniature, and it is one of the most important concepts College Board tests you on in this section. The digital divide refers to the unequal distribution of access to computing technology, the internet, and the skills needed to use them effectively. Notice that College Board's definition has multiple layers. It is not just about owning a device. It encompasses access to hardware, access to reliable internet connectivity, and access to the knowledge and education needed to use technology meaningfully. You need to hold all three of those dimensions in your head simultaneously, because exam questions will probe each one separately and sometimes try to trick you into thinking the divide is simpler than it actually is. The 3 dimensions College Board wants you to know. Think of the digital divide as a 3-legged stool. The first leg is physical access. Do people have devices like computers, smartphones, or tablets? The second leg is connectivity. Is there a reliable, affordable internet connection available? And the third leg is digital literacy. Do people have the skills to use these tools productively? A community could have computers donated to every school but still suffer from the digital divide if the internet connection is unreliable, or if teachers haven't been trained to incorporate technology into learning. Knock out any one leg and the stool falls. This matters for the AP exam because many wrong answer traps present solutions that address only one dimension. If a question asks you what would most effectively reduce the digital divide in a rural community, and one answer says provide free smartphones, while another says expand broadband infrastructure and provide digital literacy training, the second answer is almost certainly correct because it addresses multiple dimensions of the problem simultaneously. Who is affected and why? The digital divide does not fall randomly. College Board expects you to understand that it correlates strongly with socioeconomic status, geographic location, age, disability status, and language barriers. Rural communities often lack physical broadband infrastructure because laying fiber optic cables across sparse, mountainous terrain is expensive and less profitable for internet service providers. Low-income urban communities may be geographically close to infrastructure but still priced out of reliable home internet. Elderly populations may have access to devices, but lack the training to use them comfortably. This is sometimes called the second-level digital divide, emphasizing skills over access alone. Internationally, the divide becomes even more stark. In high-income countries, internet penetration rates can exceed 90%, while in some low-income nations, that figure can be below 20%. This global dimension matters because the internet's benefits, economic opportunity, healthcare information, civic participation, and educational resources are precisely the things most needed by populations that are least connected. The consequences of the digital divide. Here is where you connect this concept to the broader theme of Unit 5, the impact of computing on society. The digital divide is not an abstract inequality, it has cascading real-world consequences. During the COVID-19 pandemic, millions of students suddenly had to attend school remotely. Students without home internet access or personal devices fell dramatically behind their peers. A gap that might have seemed manageable in a physical classroom became a chasm when education moved online. This is exactly the kind of real-world scenario College Board loves to embed in free response and multiple-choice questions. Employment is another high-stakes consequence. As more jobs require digital skills, even entry-level positions often require applicants to apply online, complete digital training, or use point-of-sale software. People without digital literacy are increasingly locked out of economic mobility. Healthcare access, civic participation through online voting registration or e-government services, and even social connection through video calls all become less available to those on the wrong side of the divide. Solutions and their limitations. College Board also wants you to think critically about proposed solutions to the digital divide, and this is where edge case thinking becomes essential for exam success. Solutions generally fall into a few categories: expanding physical infrastructure, like government-funded broadband in rural areas, reducing cost barriers, like subsidized internet plans or device donation programs, and improving digital literacy, like community training centers or integrating coding into K-12 curricula. A critical thinking trap on the exam goes like this. A question will describe a community receiving donated computers and ask whether this eliminates or solves the digital divide. The answer is never that simple. Providing hardware without connectivity or training addresses only one dimension. Similarly, expanding broadband infrastructure to a community does not help if residents cannot afford the monthly service fees. Watch for answer choices that use absolute language like eliminates or fully solves. These are almost always wrong when it comes to systemic social issues like the digital divide. Connections to other units and topics. The digital divide threads through almost every unit in this course. In Unit 1, when you learned about the Internet and how data moves through networks, you were building the technical foundation that explains why connectivity matters and why uneven infrastructure creates uneven access. In Unit 2, discussions of data and privacy connect here because communities with lower digital literacy are more vulnerable to privacy violations, phishing, and misinformation. In Unit 3, when you think about algorithms and artificial intelligence, consider that training data for AI systems often overrepresents digitally connected, wealthy populations, meaning AI tools may perform worse for the very communities already underserved by technology. This intersection between algorithmic bias and the digital divide is an emerging area. College Board is increasingly testing. The exam day mindset for this topic. When you encounter a digital divide question on exam day, slow down and ask yourself three things. Which dimension of the divide is being discussed? Access, connectivity, or literacy? Who is affected and what are the specific barriers for that group? And does the proposed solution address the root causes or only the surface symptoms? Free response questions on this topic often award points specifically for identifying multiple dimensions of the divide and for acknowledging that solutions involve trade-offs or remain incomplete. Remember, College Board is not looking for cynicism here. They are not saying technology is bad or that the digital divide can never be reduced. They want you to demonstrate nuanced, systems-level thinking about how technology intersects with social equity. That nuance, applied carefully, is what separates a score of 3 from a score of 5. With the digital divide firmly in mind, your understanding of how access to computing shapes human opportunity, you are perfectly positioned to move into the next conversation about how the data we generate and share online creates its own complex web of benefits and risks in our increasingly connected world. 5.3 Computing Bias. What is computing bias and why should you care? Let's start with a question. Imagine you walk into a store and the security system flags you as a potential shoplifter, but it flags you far more often than it flags other shoppers, and the only thing that's different about you is the color of your skin. That's not a hypothetical. That's something facial recognition systems have actually done in the real world. And here's the part that matters for your AP exam. The algorithm didn't decide to be racist. The bias crept in quietly through data and design choices that seemed perfectly innocent at the time. That's the heart of computing bias, and it's one of the most conceptually rich topics in all of AP CSP. The College Board defines computing bias as when a computational artifact, think algorithms, datasets, software systems, produces results that systematically favor or disadvantage certain groups of people. Notice the word systematically. This isn't about a one-off glitch. Computing bias produces patterns of unfair outcomes, and those patterns tend to reflect and amplify inequalities that already exist in society. The 3 sources of bias you must know. For the exam, you need to understand that computing bias can originate from 3 key places: the data, the algorithm itself, and the humans who build and use it. Think of it like baking a cake. If your ingredients are bad, your cake is bad. If your recipe is flawed, your cake is bad. And if the baker makes poor choices along the way, the cake is still bad, even if the ingredients and recipe were fine. Data bias is the most common source you'll encounter on the AP exam. This happens when the training data used to build an algorithm doesn't accurately represent the real world, or when it reflects historical inequalities. Here's a classic example. If you train a hiring algorithm on resumes from the past 30 years, and those resumes come primarily from white men because women and people of color were historically excluded from those roles, your algorithm will learn that white men are better candidates. The algorithm isn't evil, it's just mirroring a biased history. On your exam, watch for questions about datasets that are incomplete, unrepresentative, or historically skewed. Those are data bias scenarios. Algorithmic bias is trickier. This is when the design of the algorithm itself introduces unfairness, even if the data looks clean. Imagine a credit scoring algorithm that uses your zip code as a factor. On the surface, that seems neutral. Zip codes are just numbers, right? But zip codes correlate heavily with race due to historical housing segregation. So the algorithm ends up penalizing people for where they live, which ends up penalizing people along racial lines. The College Board calls this unintended bias, and it's a major exam concept. The humans who wrote the algorithm didn't intend discrimination, but the effect is discriminatory nonetheless. Human bias enters through the choices developers make: what problem to solve, whose feedback to collect, what metrics to optimize for. If a development team is not diverse, they may simply not think to ask certain questions. This connects to a broader AP CSP theme. Computing reflects the values and blind spots of the people who create it. Intentional versus unintentional bias. This distinction is critical for your multiple choice questions. The AP exam loves to test whether you can tell the difference. Intentional bias is rare in algorithmic systems. It would mean someone deliberately coded discrimination into a program. Unintentional bias is far more common and far more insidious. It happens when well-meaning engineers create systems that produce unfair outcomes because they didn't recognize the bias embedded in their data or design choices. Here's the exam trap. Many students assume that if a bias was unintentional, it's not really a problem or not really bias. Wrong. The College Board is very clear that unintentional bias is still bias, and it still causes real harm. The intent of the creator does not determine whether bias exists, the effect on users does. Real-world examples the exam loves. You should be ready to analyze scenarios involving facial recognition software, predictive policing algorithms, healthcare risk scoring tools, search engine results, and social media recommendation engines. Each of these has documented cases of computing bias that the College Board has referenced in course materials and exam questions. The COMPAS algorithm is a famous example. It was used by courts to predict a defendant's likelihood of reoffending, and studies found it disproportionately flagged black defendants as high risk compared to white defendants with similar profiles. This is a perfect exam scenario. The data reflected historical arrest patterns themselves influenced by systemic bias, which led to biased predictions, which then influenced real legal decisions. Notice how the bias travels downstream and has real human consequences. Crowdsourced data and its bias implications. Here's a subtle concept that appears more often on the exam than students expect. Crowdsourced data collected from large numbers of users, like online reviews, social media posts, or Wikipedia edits, can carry bias because the crowd itself isn't representative. If your data contributors are mostly young, English-speaking, and connected to the internet, your data will reflect their perspectives and blind spots. This is especially important for natural language processing systems and content moderation tools. Connections to other units. Computing bias doesn't live in isolation. It connects directly to Unit 2, Data, where you learned about how data is collected and cleaned. Bias data collection is bias at the source. It connects to Unit 4, Big Data and Privacy, where you explored how massive datasets are used in machine learning. Scale can amplify bias rather than eliminate it. And it connects to Unit 5's broader themes about the beneficial and harmful effects of computing on society, including issues of equity, access, and power. The most common MCQ traps. Watch out for these. First, don't confuse bias with error. A bias system can be very accurate on average, but systematically unfair to a subgroup. Second, don't assume that more data automatically fixes bias if the additional data is still unrepresentative. You've just made the problem bigger. Third, remember that bias can exist in any computational artifact, not just AI. A bias spreadsheet formula is still computing bias. Finally, when a question describes a pattern of unfair outcomes across groups, that's bias. Don't let neutral-sounding technical language distract you from the social reality. The question is described. Why this matters beyond the exam. Here's what your professor wants you to carry with you. Computing bias matters because algorithms increasingly make decisions that affect people's lives: who gets a loan, who gets hired, who gets flagged by law enforcement. Recognizing bias is the first step toward building more equitable systems, and the College Board wants you to be a thoughtful, critically aware digital citizen who understands that every computational artifact is shaped by human choices. With that foundation in place, you're ready to turn the lens outward and examine the even broader question of how computing affects society at large, which is exactly what we'll explore next as we move into the crowdsourcing and the global impact of computing. 5.4 Crowdsourcing. What is crowdsourcing, and why does it matter? Picture this. It's 1014, and the British government is desperately trying to solve one of the most dangerous problems of the age: sailors dying at sea because no one could accurately determine a ship's longitude. So they did something radical. They offered a prize of £20,000, roughly $3 million today, to anyone, professional or amateur, who could crack the code. That's crowdsourcing in its oldest form. opening a difficult problem to a broad, distributed group of people rather than relying on a small team of experts. And for the AP exam, you need to understand exactly what that means in the digital age. The College Board defines crowdsourcing as the practice of obtaining input or information from a large number of people via the internet. Notice that phrase via the internet? That's not incidental. The internet is what makes modern crowdsourcing so powerful because it removes the geographic barriers that once limited who could participate in solving a problem or contributing to a project. When you think about crowdsourcing on the AP exam, always anchor your thinking around two things: a large group of contributors and a shared distributed effort enabled by computing. The 4 types of crowdsourcing you must know. Let's break this down into the categories the College Board expects you to recognize, because exam questions will absolutely test whether you can identify the correct type in a scenario. The first is crowdsourcing for information and data collection. Think about Wikipedia. No single editor could have written the world's largest encyclopedia, but millions of contributors, each adding a paragraph here and correcting a fact there, built something extraordinary together. The key characteristic here is that the crowd is providing knowledge or data that gets aggregated into something larger and more useful than any individual could create alone. The second type is distributed computing, and this one trips up a lot of students because it sounds technical. Distributed computing is when you take a problem too large for one computer and break it into smaller pieces, distributing those pieces across many computers, sometimes millions, connected over the internet. The classic example is SETI at home, a project that used the idle processing power of volunteers' home computers to analyze radio telescope data, searching for extraterrestrial intelligence. Your laptop sits idle most of the day, right? Distributed computing harnesses that wasted capacity on the AP exam. Be ready to recognize that distributed computing is a form of crowdsourcing because it relies on a crowd, in this case, a crowd of machines and their owners, contributing resources. The third type is citizen science, which combines human observation with scientific data collection. iNaturalist is a perfect example. When you photograph a bird in your backyard and upload it to the app, you're contributing to a global biodiversity database that scientists use for real research. The crowd provides observations that would be impossible to gather with a small professional team. The fourth type is crowdfunding, where a distributed group of people each contribute small amounts of money to fund a project. Kickstarter and GoFundMe are the textbook examples. The internet enables thousands of small contributions to aggregate into meaningful funding. Why crowdsourcing works, and when it doesn't. Here's an analogy that makes this click. Imagine trying to find a needle in a haystack the size of Texas. One person searching is hopeless, but 1 million people each searching their own small square can cover the entire field. That's the fundamental logic of crowdsourcing. Parallel effort scales in ways that serial effort simply cannot. The internet enables this through what the College Board calls scalability. Because digital participation has near zero marginal cost, adding the millionth contributor doesn't strain the system the way adding the millionth worker to a physical project would. This is a concept that connects directly back to Unit 4's discussion of the internet and how it enables new kinds of collaboration that were impossible before. But here's where students go wrong on the exam. Crowdsourcing is not automatically better. The College Board wants you to recognize that crowdsourcing introduces challenges around data quality and accuracy. When anyone can contribute, bad data, misinformation, and bias can enter the system. Think about how easy it is to vandalize a Wikipedia article, or how a crowdsourced map app might reflect the biases of who is and isn't contributing in a given neighborhood. This connects directly to Unit 5's broader themes about the beneficial and harmful effects of computing, a concept that comes up repeatedly across multiple sections. The connection to data and privacy, a common MCQ trap. Here's the trap that catches students every year. The exam will describe a scenario where a company collects data from millions of users, their location, their clicks, their preferences, and uses that aggregated data to build a product or train an algorithm. Students often mislabel this as crowdsourcing, but pause and ask yourself, did the users knowingly contribute? Did they volunteer their participation for a shared goal? If the data collection is passive and the users don't realize they're contributing, That blurs the line significantly and raises privacy concerns that crowdsourcing as a concept doesn't traditionally carry. On the other hand, if the scenario describes something like a city asking residents to report potholes through an app, that's clear crowdsourcing, voluntary, purposeful, and directed toward a shared civic goal. The key distinguishing features are voluntary participation and a shared, collaborative purpose. Hold on to that distinction when you read MCQ answer choices. Connecting crowdsourcing to the broader course. This topic doesn't live in isolation. Crowdsourcing connects to Unit 2's ideas about data and analysis, specifically how large datasets gathered from many contributors can reveal patterns no individual observation could. It connects to Unit 4's treatment of the Internet as an enabler of global collaboration. And it sits squarely in Unit 5's framework of examining how computing has both beneficial effects, democratizing access to knowledge, enabling scientific discovery, and potentially harmful effects, privacy concerns, the spread of misinformation through unmoderated contributions, and the risk that algorithmic systems trained on crowdsourced data inherit human biases. For the free response questions, if you're asked to describe a beneficial effect of crowdsourcing, go beyond just saying it helps people. Give a specific mechanism. Crowdsourcing enables problems to be divided among many contributors, reducing the time and cost required to solve them, and allows input from populations who would otherwise be excluded from expert-only processes. That level of specificity is what earns full rubric credit. If asked about a harmful effect, connect it to data quality, privacy, or bias, and always explain the mechanism, not just the conclusion. Quick mental checklist before you move on. Every time you see a crowdsourcing scenario on the exam, ask yourself 3 questions. First, is there a large group contributing? Second, is the internet or a computing system enabling that contribution? Third, is the goal to aggregate those contributions into something larger, data, a product, a solution, or a resource that no single contributor could create alone? If all 3 answers are yes, you're looking at crowdsourcing. As we move into the next section, we'll explore another dimension of computing's social impact, and you'll see how the themes of collaboration, data, and responsibility that run through crowdsourcing continue to shape the world that computing is building around us. 5.5 Legal and Ethical Concerns. Let's talk about something that might seem like a break from coding and algorithms, but I promise you, the College Board loves testing this material, and students who treat it as easy common sense often lose points they really didn't need to lose. Legal and ethical concerns in computing is one of those topics that sounds straightforward until you're staring at a tricky multiple-choice question that hinges on one precise distinction. So let's get this right. The big picture, why this topic exists. Imagine you write a beautiful piece of software, a photo editing app, say. You pour months into it, then someone copies your code, rebrands it, and sells it. Or imagine a company collects data about your health habits through a free app and sells that information to insurance companies. Or a student uses an AI tool to write their entire essay and submits it as their own. All 3 of these scenarios involve computing, and all 3 raise questions that are simultaneously legal and ethical. But those 2 words don't mean the same thing, and the AP exam absolutely wants you to know the difference. Legal concerns are about what the law permits or prohibits. Ethical concerns are about what is right or fair, regardless of what the law says. Something can be legal but unethical. Collecting user data through a buried terms of service clause is often perfectly legal, but many people would argue it's wrong. And something can be illegal but feel ethically justified to some people. Think about whistleblowers who leak classified information to expose wrongdoing. The College Board wants you to hold both of these lenses at once and apply them to computing scenarios. Intellectual property, licenses, and Creative Commons. The cornerstone concept here is intellectual property. When someone creates an original work, code, music, writing, images, they typically own it, and copyright law protects that ownership automatically in most countries. Copyright gives the creator exclusive rights to reproduce, distribute, and modify their work. This matters enormously in computing because software is considered a creative work under copyright law. Now, here's where it gets interesting for the exam. Not all software is locked behind traditional copyright. Developers can choose to release their work under different kinds of licenses, and you need to know the key categories. Open source software makes the source code publicly available and often allows others to modify and redistribute it, but open source doesn't mean no rules sum. Open source licenses require that any modified version also be released as open source. Others simply require attribution, meaning you have to credit the original creator. Freeware is free to use, but the source code is typically not available and you can't modify it. And proprietary software is what you think of when you buy a product. You're actually buying a license to use it, not ownership of the code itself. Creative Commons licensing is a framework the College Board specifically references, and it's worth understanding intuitively. Think of it as a menu of permissions the creator can attach to their work. A creator might say, "You can use this freely, but you must give me credit and you cannot sell it." Each Creative Commons license spells out exactly what's allowed, and they exist precisely to give creators flexibility between full copyright and fully public domain. Public domain works, by contrast, have no copyright protection at all. Either it expired or the creator explicitly released it. These works can be used freely by anyone for any purpose. Privacy and data. Privacy is another major pillar of this section. The fundamental tension here is between the enormous utility of collecting data and the genuine harm that can come from misusing it. When you use a navigation app, it improves because it collects data from millions of drivers. That's useful, but that same data reveals where you live, where you worship, where you get medical care, deeply sensitive information. The AP exam focuses on a few key ideas around privacy. First, personally identifiable information, or PII. This is any data that can be used to identify a specific individual. Names, social security numbers, email addresses, and even combinations of seemingly innocent data points can constitute PII. Here's an edge case the exam loves. Individually, knowing someone's zip code, birth date, and gender seems harmless. But research has shown that combining just those 3 data points can uniquely identify a surprisingly large percentage of Americans. This is called the aggregation problem, and it's a big deal conceptually. Data that seems anonymous can become identifying when combined. Second, understand that data collected for one purpose is often used for another, what's sometimes called secondary use. You signed up for a store loyalty card to get discounts. The store is using your purchase history to build a profile and sell it to data brokers. This is typically legal under the fine print of terms of service, but whether it's ethical is genuinely debatable, and the exam may ask you to evaluate both perspectives. Plagiarism and academic integrity in computing. The exam also touches on how intellectual property concerns apply to student work and software development specifically. Plagiarism, presenting someone else's work as your own, is an ethical violation regardless of whether legal copyright is technically at stake. In computing, this extends to copying code without attribution. Even when code is freely available online, academic integrity often requires you to acknowledge the source. This is a place where many students get tripped up thinking, if it's open source, it's fair game to copy without citing. That may be legally true depending on the license, but ethically and academically, attribution still matters. Common MCQ traps and how to dodge them. Let me flag the traps that catch students most often. First, don't confuse legal with ethical. The exam will present scenarios and ask which framework applies, and you need to be crisp about the distinction. Second, watch out for questions about open source software where one answer implies you can do literally anything with it. Almost all open source licenses have some conditions. Third, aggregation questions are sneaky. A question might describe sharing anonymous data and ask whether privacy is a concern. The correct answer is almost always yes because of the aggregation problem. Fourth, remember that copyright applies automatically to original work. A creator doesn't have to register anything for copyright to exist. Connections to other units. This topic weaves through the entire course. When you study data in Unit 2, the question of who owns and controls that data is a legal and ethical one. When Unit 4 introduced the Internet and how data travels across networks, privacy becomes immediately relevant. And when Unit 5 discusses the broader societal impact of computing, Legal and ethical frameworks are the tools you use to evaluate those impacts. The College Board treats 5.5 as the culminating lens through which all of computing gets evaluated. Think of it this way. Every technical tool you've learned about this year, algorithms, data, networks, programs, is neutral on its own. It's how humans choose to build, deploy, and govern these tools that becomes a matter of law and ethics. And that right there is exactly the kind of nuanced thinking the AP exam rewards. With legal and ethical concerns firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to step back even further and look at the big picture, how computing has shaped and continues to transform society, the economy, and the way human beings connect with one another. 5.6 Safe Computing. Let's talk about something that affects literally every single person who touches a computer, a phone, or any device connected to the internet. Safe computing. This isn't just exam content, this is life content. But for your AP CSP exam, you need to understand it with real precision, so let's build that understanding together. The threat landscape, what you're up against. Think about your home. You lock the front door, maybe have a security system, and you probably don't hand your house key to strangers. Digital security works the same way, but the threats are sneakier and the attackers are often invisible. The College Board wants you to understand 3 broad categories of threats: malware, network attacks, and social engineering. Malware is the umbrella term for malicious software. Software specifically designed to disrupt, damage, or gain unauthorized access to a system. Under that umbrella sits several specific types. A virus attaches itself to a legitimate program and spreads when that program runs, like a biological virus hitching a ride on a host cell. A worm is more aggressive. It replicates itself and spreads across networks without needing a host program, kind of like a rumor that spreads on its own without anyone needing to deliberately pass it along. Ransomware is particularly nasty. It encrypts your files and demands payment to unlock them. Imagine coming home to find all your belongings locked in a safe you can't open, with a note demanding cash. Spyware quietly monitors your behavior and sends that information to an attacker. Picture someone reading over your shoulder at the coffee shop without you ever noticing. Phishing is technically a social engineering attack, but it often delivers malware, a deceptive message, usually an email, tricks you into clicking a link or downloading something harmful. On the AP exam, you'll see questions that ask you to identify which type of attack is being described. Read those scenario descriptions carefully. The trap is confusing viruses and worms. Remember, a worm spreads independently across networks without needing a host program. If the scenario says the software spread to other computers without any user action, that's your worm signal. Encryption, the mathematical lock on your data. Encryption is one of the most important concepts in this section, and the College Board tests it consistently. At its core, encryption is the process of encoding data so that only authorized parties can read it. You take PleasNegged, run it through an encryption algorithm using a key, and produce ciphers, scrambled data that looks like nonsense without the key to decode it. There are 2 major types you need to know. Symmetric encryption uses the same key to encrypt and decrypt. It's fast and efficient, like using the same physical key to both lock and unlock your front door. The problem? You have to share that key with whoever needs to read your message, and sharing it securely is a real challenge. Asymmetric encryption, also called public key cryptography, solves this elegantly. Every user gets 2 mathematically linked keys, a public key and a private key. You can share your public key with the entire world. It's safe to post it everywhere. Someone encrypts a message using your public key, and only your private key can decrypt it. It's like giving everyone a special padlock that only you can open with your unique key. The AP exam loves to test whether you understand that the public key encrypts and the private key decrypts, and that you never share your private key. A very common wrong answer trap presents a scenario and asks which key is used to encrypt. Students second-guess themselves and choose the private key. Don't fall for it. Public encrypts, private decrypts. The HTTPS you see in your browser's address bar, that's using a combination of asymmetric and symmetric encryption through a protocol called TLS. Your browser and the server use asymmetric encryption to securely exchange a symmetric session key. Then switch to the faster symmetric encryption for actual data transfer. The AP exam may reference this process conceptually. Understand that HTTPS indicates encrypted, authenticated communication. Authentication and access control. Knowing something is encrypted isn't enough. You also need to know who's allowed in. Authentication is the process of verifying identity. The College Board organizes authentication factors into 3 categories: something you know, like a password; something you have, like a phone or security token; and something you are, like a fingerprint or facial scan. Multi-factor authentication, or MFA, combines 2 or more of these. Using just a password is one factor. Adding a text message code to your phone adds a second factor from a different category. MFA dramatically reduces the risk of unauthorized access, even if a password is stolen. Authorization is what happens after authentication. Once the system knows who you are, it determines what you're allowed to do. These 2 concepts are commonly confused on the exam. Authentication asks, "Are you who you say you are?" Authorization asks, "Are you allowed to do what you're trying to do?" Different question, different process. Staying safe practices and policies. The exam also expects you to understand practical protective measures. Keeping software updated is critical because updates often patch security vulnerabilities that attackers exploit. Using strong, unique passwords prevents credential stuffing attacks where a stolen password from one site unlocks others. A firewall monitors incoming and outgoing network traffic and blocks connections that violate security rules. Think of it as a bouncer checking IDs at the door. Certificate authorities are trusted third parties that issue digital certificates, verifying that a website is who it claims to be. When you see that padlock in your browser, a certificate authority has vouched for the site's identity. This is part of why HTTPS isn't just about encryption, it's also about trust. Connections to other units. Safe computing doesn't exist in a vacuum within this course. In Unit 5's broader impact discussions, you'll connect privacy concerns from Section 5.5 directly to safe computing. Personal data that's not secured becomes a privacy violation waiting to happen. Encryption concepts connect to Unit 2's discussion of how data is represented and transmitted across networks. The network architecture topics from Unit 4, especially how the Internet routes packets, matter here because attackers exploit those pathways. When you think about data breaches, you're connecting cybersecurity to the ethical and social impact discussions throughout Unit 5. One final edge case the exam tests. Understand that no security measure is perfect. The AP CSP curriculum acknowledges that security is always a trade-off. Stronger security often means less convenience, and determined attackers can sometimes find ways around defenses. The question isn't whether risk can be eliminated, but whether it can be managed to an acceptable level. With your digital security toolkit now fully assembled, from malware types to encryption keys to authentication factors, you're ready to move into the broader ethical and legal dimensions of how computing systems affect society, which is exactly where we're headed next. 5.7 Intellectual Property and Licensing, Creative Commons Open Source. Let's talk about something that affects every single thing you create on a computer and every single thing you borrow from the internet. Intellectual property and licensing might sound like dry legal territory, but trust me, this topic shows up on the AP exam in ways that catch students off guard every year. And once you understand it, you'll never look at a YouTube video, a GitHub repository, or a stock photo the same way again. What is intellectual property, and why does computing care? Intellectual property, or IP, is the legal concept that gives creators ownership over the things they make with their minds: code, music, writing, images, inventions. Think of it this way. If you spend 6 months writing a novel, you'd want some say over who gets to copy it, sell it, or remix it, right? The law agrees with you. Copyright is the specific form of IP protection that applies most directly to computing and creative digital work. The moment you write original code, design a graphic, or compose a song, copyright attaches automatically. You don't have to register it or put a symbol on it. This is a common exam trap. Students assume copyright only exists if it's officially filed or labeled. It doesn't, it's automatic. Now, here's where computing changes the conversation. The internet made copying essentially free and instantaneous. That creates enormous tension. Sharing code can help everyone build better software faster, but it also means someone else might profit from your work without permission or credit. The computing community has responded to this tension in really creative ways, and that's exactly what the College Board wants you to understand. Copyright, licenses, and the permission framework. A license is basically a set of rules the creator attaches to their work that tells others what they can and cannot do with it. Think of a license as the terms of a lease on an apartment. The landlord, creator, still owns the property, but the lease license spells out what the tenant user is allowed to do. Can you paint the walls? Sublet to a friend? The creator keeps ownership, but the license grants specific permissions. Without a license, you should assume you have no rights to use someone else's work beyond what's called fair use, a narrow legal exception for things like commentary, criticism, or educational purposes. The AP exam does not require you to know the detailed legal boundaries of fair use, but it does expect you to know that using someone else's copyrighted work without permission or a license is infringement, and that infringement has real consequences. Creative Commons, a middle ground worth knowing cold. Here's where it gets really elegant. A lawyer named Lawrence Lessig and his colleagues created the Creative Commons licensing system in 2001 because they saw a gap between all rights reserved, copyright, and the public domain, where all rights are given up. Creative Commons licenses let creators say, "You can use my work, but here are the specific conditions." For the AP exam, you need to understand the 4 building blocks of Creative Commons licenses. Attribution, abbreviated by, means you must give credit to the original creator. Non-commercial, abbreviated NC, means you can use the work but not for commercial profit. No derivatives, abbreviated ND, means you can share the work but you cannot alter or remix it. Share alike, abbreviated SA, means if you do modify it, you must release your version under the same license. These blocks combine into specific licenses. For example, CC by SA means you can use and remix the work as long as you give credit and share your version under the same terms. That's the license Wikipedia uses, which is a fantastic real-world anchor for your memory. The exam loves to test whether you can identify what is and isn't permitted under a given CC license. The biggest trap: students confuse non-commercial with no derivatives. They're completely separate conditions. A CC by NC license allows remixing but not commercial use. A CC by ND license allows commercial use but not remixing. Read those carefully on exam day. Also critical, the most permissive Creative Commons license is CC by, which only requires attribution. The most restrictive is CC by NC ND, which requires attribution, prohibits commercial use, and prohibits derivatives. And then there's CC0, which is essentially a dedication to the public domain. The creator waives all rights. That's as open as it gets. Open source software, sharing the blueprint. Now let's talk about open source, because this is a major concept in AP CSP. When software is open source, its source code, the actual human-readable instructions the programmer wrote, is publicly available. Anyone can read it, modify it, and often redistribute it. The key word there is often, because open source doesn't mean no license. It means the license grants broad freedoms, particularly around viewing and modifying the code. Compare this to proprietary software, sometimes called closed source. With proprietary software, you get the compiled, runnable program, but the source code is secret. You cannot legally look inside it, modify it, or redistribute it. Microsoft Windows and Adobe Photoshop are classic examples of proprietary software. The most famous open source license is the GNU General Public License, or GPL. The GPL includes what's called a copyleft provision, a clever play on words, which means any derivative work you create must also be released under the GPL. It's viral in the best sense. The share-alike Creative Commons license works on the same philosophical principle. Another widely used open source license is the MIT license, which is extremely permissive. It basically says, use this however you want, even in proprietary products, just keep the copyright notice. The Apache license is similar. These permissive licenses power much of the modern tech industry. Companies like Google, Apple, and Microsoft use MIT licensed code in their commercial products all the time. Common exam traps and connections to other units. One mistake students make is thinking free software means free of cost. In the open source world, free refers to freedom. Freedom to use, modify, and share, not price. A company can sell open source software. They just have to also provide the source code. Another trap: students sometimes think that because something is posted on the internet, it's in the public domain or free to use. Absolutely not. Posting something online does not change its copyright status one bit. This topic connects tightly to Unit 5's broader themes about the societal impacts of computing. When you discuss who benefits from innovation and whether computing increases or decreases equity, open source software is central to that conversation. It lowers barriers to entry globally. It also connects to the abstractions unit. Open source libraries and APIs are examples of how programmers build on existing abstractions to create new things, which is a core computing practice. On the FRQ side, if intellectual property appears in a written response, College Board looks for precise vocabulary: copyright, license, open source, Creative Commons, and the specific conditions of the license in question. Vague answers like "you can share it freely" without specifying the conditions will cost you points. Understanding who owns creative work and on what terms is foundational to participating ethically in the computing world. And that ethical dimension leads us directly into our next topic, which examines the broader harms and benefits that computing innovations bring to individuals and society. 5.8 Privacy and Personal Data. What is personal data? Really, let's start with something that probably happened to you this week. You searched for a new pair of sneakers online, and suddenly every website you visit is showing you sneaker ads. You didn't sign a form, you didn't give anyone permission, so how did that happen? That right there is the heart of what College Board wants you to understand in this section, and mastering it could be worth several points on your AP exam. Personal data is any information that describes or identifies an individual. The College Board uses this term broadly, and you should too. It includes the obvious stuff: your name, your address, your phone number, but it also includes things that feel less personal, like your location history, your browsing patterns, the time you typically wake up based on when your phone starts getting active, and even the combination of seemingly harmless details that, when put together, uniquely identify you. That last piece is critical, so let's give it a name. When you combine multiple pieces of individually non-identifying data to identify a person, that process is called re-identification, and the concept behind it is called the aggregation problem. Here's the analogy that makes this stick. Imagine I tell you someone is a 34-year-old woman, not very identifying, right? Now I add that she lives in a small rural town, drives a red truck, works at the only hospital in the county, and has 2 kids in elementary school. Suddenly, people in that community know exactly who we're talking about, even though none of those individual facts seemed sensitive. That's the aggregation problem. The AP exam loves to test whether you understand that combining individually harmless data points can create a privacy violation, even when no single piece would. If you see a question where someone shares just their zip code or just their age, and the question asks whether privacy is at risk, the answer depends entirely on what other data is being combined with it. How data gets collected. Now let's talk about how this data is gathered, because the exam will ask you about the mechanisms. There are 2 broad categories you should know: data that people provide voluntarily and data that is collected passively or without explicit awareness. Voluntary data is straightforward. You fill out a form, create an account, post on social media, you knowingly give that information. Passive data collection is trickier and more relevant to modern privacy concerns. This includes cookies, small files that websites store on your browser to track your activity, metadata, data about data, like not the content of a text message, but the fact that you sent a message at 2:47 a.m. to a particular number, GPS location data from apps, and purchase histories. The AP exam is especially fond of metadata because students consistently underestimate how revealing it is. The content of a phone call might be private, but metadata about who you called, for how long, and how often can reveal deeply personal things about your relationships, health, and habits. Think of it this way. If a records show you called a cancer treatment center 14 times last month, no one needs to hear what you said. The metadata tells the story. Personally identifiable information, PII. The College Board uses a specific term here that you absolutely must know. Personally identifiable information, or PII. This is information that can be used to distinguish or trace an individual's identity, either alone or when combined with other information. Social security numbers, biometric data like fingerprints, email addresses, and financial account numbers are classic examples. The exam may ask you to identify whether something constitutes PII, and the tricky cases are always the combined ones. Remember the aggregation problem. One common MCQ trap is being presented with a scenario where a company claims it only shares anonymized data and asking whether privacy is protected. The correct answer is almost always not necessarily, because truly anonymous data is harder to achieve than it sounds. Studies have shown that viewing Netflix watch history or even zip codes combined with birth dates can re-identify individuals in supposedly anonymous datasets. If the exam presents anonymization as a complete privacy solution, treat that claim with skepticism. The trade-off between convenience and privacy. Here's where it gets philosophically interesting, and College Board wants you to think critically about it. Most privacy violations aren't the result of malicious hackers, they're the result of trade-offs we make willingly. You share your location with a Maps app because it gives you turn-by-turn directions. You let a fitness app track your heart rate because you want health insight. Each of those transactions involves exchanging personal data for a service, and most people do it without reading the terms of service. The AP exam wants you to recognize that these trade-offs exist on a spectrum, and that reasonable people can disagree about where the line should be. However, the exam will not ask you to take a political stance, it will ask you to identify the privacy implications of a given technology or policy. When a question describes a scenario involving data collection, your job is to name what type of data is involved, explain how it could be misused or combined, and evaluate whether the stated benefit justifies the privacy cost given the context. Connections to other units. This topic doesn't exist in isolation, it weaves through the entire course. In Unit 2, when you studied the Internet, you learned about how data travels across networks and how each hop can potentially expose information that connects directly here because network traffic is itself a source of data collection. In Unit 4, when you discussed algorithms and bias, the data used to train those systems almost always involves personal data, which raises questions about consent and surveillance. And in Section 5.6, you encountered the idea that computing innovations can have unintended effects. Mass data collection is one of the clearest examples of an unintended consequence reshaping society. What to watch for on the exam. The most common MCQ trap in this section is the false sense of security from partial anonymization. Don't be fooled by the names were removed, that is rarely sufficient. The second trap is confusing legal with ethical. Something being legal doesn't make it not a privacy violation, and the exam will sometimes test whether you can distinguish the two. Third, watch for questions that conflate security and privacy. They are related but not the same. Security protects data from unauthorized access. Privacy is about controlling how data is used, even by authorized parties. For free response questions, if you're asked to discuss privacy implications of a computing innovation, always mention the aggregation problem by name if it's relevant, identify specific types of PII involved, and discuss both the benefits and the risks in a balanced way. College Board rewards nuance. Understanding privacy gives you the ethical lens the entire AP course is built around, and that lens becomes even sharper as we turn next to the broader impact of computing on society, culture, and the ways humans interact with one another at scale. 5.9 Data collection and tracking, cookies, PII, metadata. Imagine you walk into your favorite coffee shop, and before you even open your mouth, the barista says, "The usual, right? Grande oat milk latte, extra shot, your name's Jordan." That feels warm and personal, almost magical, But now imagine a stranger on the street somehow knew your full name, your home address, your daily schedule, your medical history, and every website you visited last Tuesday. That feeling is very different. That's exactly the tension at the heart of this topic, and the AP exam wants you to understand both sides of it deeply. Personally Identifiable Information, PII. Let's start with the foundation, Personally Identifiable Information, or PII. The College Board defines PII as any information that can be used to identify, contact, or locate a specific individual. The classic examples are your name, social security number, date of birth, home address, phone number, email address, and biometric data like fingerprints or facial recognition patterns. But here's where students get tripped up on the multiple choice questions. PII isn't always obviously identifying on its own. A zip code alone probably doesn't identify you. Your employer alone probably doesn't either, but combine your zip code, employer, date of birth, and gender, and suddenly you're uniquely identifiable. Research has shown that just 3 data points, zip code, birth date, and sex, can uniquely identify over 87% of the U.S. population. The AP exam loves this idea, which brings us to a crucial concept, the aggregation problem. The aggregation problem is the phenomenon where combining multiple pieces of individually harmless, non-PII data creates a privacy violation. Think of it like this: one puzzle piece tells you nothing, but snap enough pieces together and the full picture emerges. Your username on a gaming forum isn't PII, your city of residence isn't PII, your job title isn't PII. But combine all 3 on the same public profile, and now someone can probably find you in real life. This is one of the most frequently tested ideas in this section, and it connects directly back to Unit 2's discussion of data and the power of combining datasets. When you see an MCQ that lists several non-sensitive data points and asks whether a privacy concern exists, always think aggregation. Cookies and web tracking. Now, let's talk about cookies, not the chocolate chip kind, though I wish. An HTTP cookie is a small text file that a website stores on your device through your browser. When you log into a site, it drops a cookie so that on your next visit, the site remembers who you are. That's a first-party cookie, and it's relatively benign. It's the coffee shop barista remembering your order. The convenience is real, and the data is controlled by the site you're actually visiting. Third-party cookies are a different story entirely. These are cookies placed on your device by a domain other than the one you're visiting, usually an advertising network. Say you visit a shoe store's website and an ad network drops its own cookie. Then you visit a news site, a recipe blog, and a sports website, all of which use that same ad network. By now that network has built a detailed profile of your browsing behavior without you ever directly interacting with it. This is cross-site tracking, and it's the engine behind those ads that seem to follow you across the internet. For the AP exam, understand that cookies themselves aren't malicious. They're a technology that can be used for both convenience and surveillance. Metadata. Here's a concept that surprises students every time: metadata. Metadata is data about data. It describes the properties and context of other data without necessarily revealing the content itself. When you send a text message, the content might be, "I love you," but the metadata is who you sent it to, when, from what device, from what location, and how long the message was. Here's the chilling insight the exam wants you to internalize. Metadata can be more revealing than the content itself. Security experts and government agencies have long argued that metadata alone can reconstruct an incredibly detailed picture of someone's life, their relationships, routines, health concerns, political activities, and movements. Think about it this way. You don't need to read someone's emails to know they're job hunting. You just need to see that they've been emailing recruiters at 9 p.m. from their home address. You don't need to read their texts to know they visited an oncologist. You just need the location data attached to their photos. This is a favorite MCQ scenario. A question will describe a scenario where content is protected, but metadata is exposed, and ask whether a privacy concern exists. The answer is always yes, and you need to be able to articulate why. Common exam traps and connections to other units. There are a few traps the College Board sets repeatedly that you should watch for. First, students often assume that anonymous data is always safe. It isn't because of the aggregation problem. Seemingly anonymous datasets can be re-identified. Second, students confuse encryption protecting privacy with data not being collected at all. These are completely different things. A company can encrypt your data and still collect every piece of it. Third, don't confuse cookies with malware. Cookies are not viruses and they don't damage your system. They're tracking mechanisms, not destructive code. That distinction matters on both multiple choice and free response questions. This topic also connects directly to your earlier work in Unit 5 on the digital divide and access to information, as well as to Unit 2's exploration of how data is stored, processed, and used to build models. The ethical dimensions here feed into discussions about bias in data collection. If companies collect more data on some populations than others, the resulting algorithms may reflect and amplify those inequalities. You'll also want to connect this to the concept of informed consent, the idea that users should understand what data is being collected, by whom, and for what purpose before they agree to share it. The AP exam frequently asks you to evaluate a scenario and determine whether a described data practice raises a privacy concern under these frameworks. Your answer should always engage with specifics. Name the type of data, explain whether aggregation is occurring, and identify whether meaningful consent was present. From here, we shift into the broader social implications of computing, examining how these data practices feed into surveillance systems, automated decision-making, and the ongoing debate over what privacy means in a world where our digital footprints never truly disappear. 5.10 Cybersecurity Threats: Phishing, Malware, Ransomware, DDoS, SQL Injection, Man in the Middle. Setting the stage: why cybersecurity matters on the exam. Imagine you've left your house but forgotten to lock the front door. Now imagine that door leads not just to your living room, but to your bank account, your medical records, your private messages, and to every other person who has ever trusted you with their information. That's essentially what an insecure digital system looks like. The College Board wants you to understand that cybersecurity isn't just a technical topic for IT professionals. It's a societal issue with real human consequences, and it sits at the heart of Unit 5's Impact of Computing framework. On the AP exam, you'll be asked to identify specific threats, explain how they work conceptually, and evaluate their broader effects. Let's walk through each one so nothing surprises you on exam day. Phishing, the art of the deception. Phishing is a social engineering attack, and that phrase is key. The College Board uses it deliberately. A social engineering attack exploits human psychology rather than a technical vulnerability in software. The attacker impersonates a trusted entity, your bank, your school's IT department, a popular website, and tricks you into voluntarily handing over credentials like a username and password. Think of it like a con artist dressed as a postal worker asking you to confirm your address while actually scoping out your home. The technical system wasn't broken. The human was the vulnerability. On the AP exam, a common trap is confusing phishing with malware. Here's the distinction: phishing is about deception to obtain information or access, while malware is malicious software that actually infiltrates a system. They can work together. A phishing email might contain a malicious link that installs malware, but they are categorically different threats. If an MCQ describes someone clicking a link in a suspicious email and their passwords being stolen, that's phishing. If the question describes software secretly running in the background and corrupting files, that's malware. Malware and ransomware. Uninvited guests. Malware is an umbrella term for any malicious software. Viruses, worms, spyware, and ransomware all live under this roof. The College Board defines malware broadly as software designed to damage, disrupt, or gain unauthorized access to a system. A virus attaches itself to a legitimate program and spreads when that program runs. A worm spreads on its own through networks without needing a host file. That distinction occasionally shows up in MCQs. Ransomware is a specific and increasingly famous type of malware that deserves special attention. When ransomware infects your system, it encrypts your files, making them completely unreadable. and then demands payment, usually in cryptocurrency, for the decryption key. Think of it as a kidnapper locking all your valuables in a safe and then telling you the combination costs money. Real-world examples like the 2021 Colonial Pipeline attack made ransomware a household term, and the College Board reflects this real-world relevance. On the exam, remember that encryption is the technical mechanism that makes ransomware so destructive, and that's a direct connection back to Unit 2, where you studied how encryption works to protect data. Ransomware weaponizes that same concept against users. Distributed denial of service, flooding the entrance. A distributed denial of service attack, or DDoS, works on a beautifully simple but devastating principle. Imagine a restaurant that can serve 100 customers an hour. Now imagine 10,000 people all show up at once, not to eat, but just to stand in the doorway. No real customer can get in, and the restaurant effectively shuts down. A DDoS attack does exactly this to a server or website by overwhelming it with traffic from many sources simultaneously. The distributed part is critical. The traffic comes from thousands of compromised computers called a botnet, making it nearly impossible to block a single source. The AP exam will test whether you understand that DDoS attacks don't steal data, they deny access. This is a disruption attack, not a theft attack. That's an important conceptual distinction. Also note the connection to computing's fault tolerance concepts from earlier units. Systems are often designed with redundancy and load balancing, specifically to mitigate DDoS vulnerabilities. SQL injection. Talking to the database directly. SQL injection is one of the more technically specific threats on the AP exam, but the concept is accessible once you see the right analogy. A database uses a language called SQL to retrieve information. When you log into a website, it typically asks the database, "Do you have a user with this username and this password?" Normally that's a clean, safe question. But if the website doesn't properly validate what users type into input fields, an attacker can type actual SQL code into that field, and the database will execute it as a command, rather than treating it as plain text. Think of a library catalog where you're supposed to type a book title. If you typed a hidden instruction that said, "and also show me every private patron record," a poorly designed system might actually obey. SQL injection exploits insufficient input validation, and that connection to programming principles is intentional on the exam. You studied input validation in the programming units. Here's why it matters in the real world. Man in the middle, eavesdropping on the conversation. A man-in-the-middle attack, often abbreviated MIT-M, occurs when an attacker secretly intercepts communication between two parties who believe they're communicating directly with each other. Picture two people passing notes in class, but someone in the middle is reading every note, possibly altering it, before passing it along. Neither the sender nor the receiver knows anything is wrong. This is why unsecured public Wi-Fi networks are dangerous. An attacker on the same network can position themselves between you and, say, your bank's website. The defense against MITM attacks is encryption, particularly the kind used in HTTPS and TLS protocols. When data is properly encrypted end-to-end, the interceptor might capture the communication, but can't read or alter it meaningfully. On the exam, if a question asks how to prevent a MIT attack using encryption or using HTTPS is your answer, this circles back to your earlier study of secure protocols and the role of encryption in protecting data in transit. Pulling it all together, what the exam really tests. The College Board wants you to see these threats not as isolated technical curiosities, but as evidence of a core principle. The same features that make the internet open and interconnected also make it vulnerable. Every threat you've studied here exploits some aspect of trust, openness, or complexity. Phishing exploits trust and familiar identities. DDoS exploits openness of network access. SQL injection exploits the complexity of software input handling. Understanding that framing will help you answer the broader impact of computing questions that ask you to evaluate trade-offs in system design. One final exam tip: don't confuse authentication, verifying who you are, with authorization, determining what you're allowed to do. Many cybersecurity questions hinge on this distinction, and mixing them up is a reliable way to lose a point. Phishing, for instance, is fundamentally an attack on authentication. The attacker wants your credentials so they can falsely authenticate as you. With a solid grasp of cybersecurity threats, you're perfectly positioned to move into the closely related territory of how we defend against them: encryption, authentication protocols, and the principles of secure system design that make these attacks far harder to execute. 5.11 Encryption and Data Security: Symmetric, Asymmetric, Public Key, HTTPS, SSL, TLS. Let's talk about something that protects you every single day without you even thinking about it. Every time you log into your bank account, buy something on Amazon, or even just check your email, encryption is working behind the scenes like an invisible bodyguard. For the AP exam, you need to understand not just that encryption exists, but how it works, why we use different types, and what problems each type solves. Let's build this up together from the ground up. The core problem encryption solves: imagine you want to pass a note to a friend in class, but you have to hand it to 3 other students first to get it there. Any one of those students could read it. That's essentially what happens when data travels across the internet. It passes through routers, servers, and networks, owned by all kinds of different people. Encryption is the process of encoding data so that only authorized parties can read it. The College Board defines encryption as transforming data into an unreadable format using a key, and it's the foundational concept this entire section is built around. The original readable data is called Pleitzainenkt, and the scrambled, unreadable version is called ciphertext. The process of converting ciphertext back to plain text is called decryption. Symmetric encryption. One key does everything. The first type of encryption you need to know is symmetric encryption, sometimes called private key encryption. Here's the analogy. Imagine a lockbox with one key. You lock it, you unlock it. Same key, both directions. In symmetric encryption, the same key is used to both encrypt and decrypt the data. This is fast and efficient, which makes it great for encrypting large amounts of data. But here's the problem, and this is a classic MCQ trap. How do you safely share that key in the first place? If you and your friend both need the same key to read each other's messages, how do you get the key to your friend without someone intercepting it? You can't encrypt the key with itself, so you'd have to send it over an insecure channel, which defeats the whole purpose. This is called the key distribution problem, and it's the main weakness of symmetric encryption. The AP exam loves asking about this limitation, so lock it in your memory. Asymmetric encryption and the public key solution. This is where asymmetric encryption, also called public key encryption, comes in, and honestly, this is one of the most elegant ideas in all of computer science. Instead of one key, you get a pair of mathematically linked keys, a public key and a private key. Here's the magic. What one key locks, only the other key can unlock. Think of it like a special mailbox. Anyone can drop a letter in. The slot is public. Anyone can use it. But only you have the key to open the box and read what's inside. Your public key is the mail slot. You share it with the entire world, post it on your website, give it to strangers, it doesn't matter. Anyone can use your public key to encrypt a message to you. But the only person who can decrypt it is the person holding the corresponding private key, which you never share with anyone, ever. This elegantly solves the key distribution problem. You never have to secretly transmit a private key because the key you share publicly can only encrypt. It can't decrypt, only your private key can do that, and it never leaves your hands. The AP exam will test you on the directionality here, so be precise. A sender encrypts using the recipient's public key, and the recipient decrypts using their own private key. Get this backwards and you'll lose points. A common wrong answer trap is to say, the sender uses their own public key. No, you use the other person's public key to send something securely to them. Digital signatures, flipping the process. Asymmetric encryption has a second brilliant application, digital signatures, which prove that a message actually came from who it claims to be from. Here the process flips. You encrypt something with your private key, and anyone can verify it by decrypting with your public key. Since only you have your private key, only you could have created that signature. This proves authenticity. It's the digital equivalent of a verified signature on a contract. The AP exam distinguishes this from regular encryption. Regular asymmetric encryption is about confidentiality, keeping secrets, while digital signatures are about authenticity and integrity, proving who sent something and that it wasn't changed. HTTPS, SSL, and TLS, putting it all together. Now you have the tools to understand what actually happens when you see that little padlock icon in your browser. HTTPS stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure, and it's the standard for secure web communication. Underneath HTTPS is a protocol called TLS, Transport Layer Security, which replaced the older SSL Secure Sockets layer. You'll see both terms on the exam. Just know that SSL TLS refers to the same family of security protocols, with TLS being the modern standard. Here's how a secure connection actually works, and this is worth understanding conceptually for the FRQ. When your browser connects to a secure website, they perform what's called a handshake. First, the website sends its digital certificate, which contains its public key and is verified by a trusted third party called a certificate authority. Your browser uses asymmetric encryption to securely exchange a temporary shared key. Then for the actual data transfer, they switch to symmetric encryption using that shared key, because symmetric encryption is faster for large amounts of data. This hybrid approach, using asymmetric encryption to solve the key distribution problem and then symmetric encryption for efficiency, is the real-world solution to everything we've discussed. What the AP exam expects you to know cold. A few critical distinctions you must own for test day. Symmetric encryption uses one shared key and is fast, but has the key distribution problem. Asymmetric encryption uses a public-private key pair, solves key distribution, but is slower. HTTPS uses both, asymmetric for the handshake, symmetric for the session. Encryption protects confidentiality. It does not by itself prevent data from being altered or guarantee who sent it. That's what digital signatures and certificates add. The College Board also wants you to understand that encryption is not perfect. Even strong encryption can be vulnerable if private keys are stolen, if the implementation is flawed, or through social engineering. This connects directly to Unit 5's broader themes about the impact of computing on privacy and security. Topics like phishing, data breaches, and cybersecurity all tie back to what happens when the encryption layer is bypassed or the human element fails. Speaking of the human element and the broader security landscape, let's move forward and look at how computing innovations introduce new kinds of risk beyond just data in transit, as we explore the digital divide and the societal implications of who has access to secure, reliable computing in the first place. 5.12 Authentication and Authorization, Multi-factor authentication, usernames, passwords, biometrics. Let's talk about something you interact with every single day, probably before you even finish your first cup of coffee. Unlocking your phone, logging into your email, tapping your card at a store. All of that lives in the world of authentication and authorization, and the College Board wants you to understand exactly how these concepts work, why they matter, and where they can fail. The core distinction, authentication versus authorization. Here's the single most important thing to get straight right from the start, because the AP exam will absolutely test whether you can tell these two apart. Authentication is the process of verifying who you are. Authorization is the process of determining what you're allowed to do. Think of it like a concert. When the person at the door checks your ticket and your ID, that's authentication. They're confirming you are who you claim to be. When they wave you toward the VIP section versus the general standing area, that's authorization. Your verified identity now determines your level of access. You must be authenticated before you can be authorized. One comes first, always. A common MCQ trap is a question that describes a system granting someone access to files and asks whether this is authentication or authorization. The answer is authorization. Authentication would be the login step before that. Don't mix them up. Usernames and passwords. The most familiar form of authentication is the classic username and password combination. The username tells the system who is trying to log in, and the password is the secret knowledge that proves the claim. On the AP exam, you need to understand that passwords represent something you know. That phrase is critical and comes back in the context of multi-factor authentication. The College Board emphasizes that strong passwords are a key security practice. A strong password should be long, use a mix of character types, letters, numbers, symbols, and this is crucial, should not be reused across multiple services. Why does reuse matter? Because if one service gets breached and your password is exposed, attackers can try that same password on your bank, your email, everywhere. This is called a credential stuffing attack, and it's devastatingly common. Here's an analogy. Imagine you have one key that opens your house, your car, your office, and your locker. One stolen key and everything is compromised. Unique passwords are like unique locks. A breach in one place doesn't cascade into a total loss. Multi-factor authentication. Now we arrive at one of the most heavily tested concepts in this section, multi-factor authentication, or MFA. The College Board wants you to know that MFA combines two or more of the following independent categories of verification. The first factor is something you know, like a password or a PIN. The second factor is something you have, like a phone that receives a text message code, a hardware token, or an authentication app. The third factor is something you are. This is biometrics, which we'll get to in just a moment. The key word in multi-factor is multi. It must involve more than one category, not just more than one step from the same category. Here's an exam trap to watch for. If a system asks for a password and then a second, different password, that is still only single-factor authentication. Both are something you know. True multi-factor authentication requires factors from different categories, a password plus a fingerprint scan. That's MFA. Two passwords? Not MFA. This distinction shows up on MCQs regularly. Why does MFA dramatically improve security? Because an attacker would need to compromise both factors simultaneously. Stealing your password doesn't help if they also need your physical phone to receive the verification code. The factors protect each other. Think of it as a bank vault with two separate keys, held by two different people. Neither one alone can open the vault. Biometrics represent the something you are authentication factor. These are physical or behavioral characteristics unique to you. Fingerprints, facial recognition, retinal scans, voice recognition, even the way you walk, your phone's face unlock, and the fingerprint reader on your laptop are everyday biometric systems. The AP exam asks you to understand both the benefits and the drawbacks of biometrics. The benefit is convenience and uniqueness. You always have your fingerprint with you, and it's incredibly difficult to replicate. The drawback, and this is something the College Board emphasizes, is that biometric data cannot be changed. If your password is stolen, you create a new one. If your fingerprint data is stolen from a poorly secured database, you cannot get a new fingerprint. This permanent vulnerability is a real concern with biometric systems, and a concept you should be able to articulate on an FRQ. Why this all matters: security and trust. The broader context here connects directly to Unit 5's overarching theme, the impact of computing on society. Authentication systems protect personal data, financial information, and private communications. When these systems fail, through weak passwords, phishing attacks that steal credentials, or data breaches, the consequences can be severe for individuals, organizations, and even governments. The College Board also wants you to understand that no authentication system is perfectly secure. MFA significantly reduces risk, but doesn't eliminate it. Someone could steal both your password and your phone. A biometric system could have a false acceptance rate that allows unauthorized users in. Understanding that security is always a balance between protection and practicality is a nuanced point that can distinguish an average answer from a top-scoring FRQ response. Connecting to other units, this topic doesn't exist in isolation. It connects directly to topics you've seen earlier in Unit 5. Cybersecurity threats like phishing, malware, and social engineering all target authentication systems. A phishing attack, for example, tricks you into handing over your something you know voluntarily. MFA provides a safety net even in that scenario. You'll also see connections to Unit 2's discussions of how data is stored and transmitted. Because passwords are stored as hashed values, a concept tied to encryption and data security that the exam may probe together with authentication in a single question. For FRQ responses, remember to use College Board's exact terminology, authentication and authorization, as distinct terms, multi-factor authentication spelled out, and the three factors labeled as something you know, something you have, and something you are. Graders are looking for precise language. As we move forward, we'll build on this foundation of trust and security to examine how the computing systems that handle all this authenticated data can fail, and what society does when they do. 5.13 Network Security and Redundancy. Firewalls, rogue access points, packet sniffing. The big picture. Why networks need defending. Imagine you built an incredible city, roads, power grids, communication towers, everything connected beautifully. Now imagine that because everything is connected, a bad actor can potentially reach any part of that city from any entrance. That's the internet. The same openness that makes the internet revolutionary also makes it vulnerable. In this section, we're going to explore how networks protect themselves, where the weaknesses are, and what the College Board expects you to know cold on exam day. Firewalls, the bouncers of the network world. A firewall is hardware or software that monitors and controls incoming and outgoing network traffic based on predetermined security rules. Think of it as the bouncer at an exclusive club. It has a guest list, and if your packet isn't on the list, you're not getting in. More precisely, a firewall inspects data packets and decides whether to allow or block them based on things like IP address, port number, or protocol type. Here's the key conceptual distinction the AP exam loves to test. A firewall does not make your network invincible, and it does not encrypt your data. It is purely a traffic filtering mechanism. Students often confuse firewalls with encryption tools. Don't fall into that trap. A firewall keeps unwanted traffic out. Encryption scrambles data so it can't be read even if it's intercepted. These are two separate layers of protection, and the exam will absolutely try to mix them up on you. Firewalls can be positioned at the network level, protecting an entire organization's infrastructure, or at the device level like the firewall built into your laptop. The College Board wants you to understand that firewalls are a preventive security measure. They stop threats from entering, but they can't undo damage that's already been done, and they can't catch every threat, particularly sophisticated ones that disguise themselves as legitimate traffic. Rogue access points, the wolf in sheep's clothing. Now let's talk about one of the sneakiest threats in networking, the rogue access point. A rogue access point is an unauthorized wireless access point that has been installed on a network without the network administrator's knowledge. Picture this. You walk into a coffee shop, see a Wi-Fi network called Coffee Shop Free, and connect to it. Except that network was set up by someone sitting 2 tables away with a laptop and a cheap router. You've just handed your internet traffic over to a stranger. This is sometimes called an evil twin attack when the rogue access point is deliberately made to mimic a legitimate network. The danger here is that once you connect through a rogue access point, every single piece of unencrypted data you send, emails, login credentials, browsing history, flows directly through the attacker's device. The AP exam expects you to understand that rogue access points are a network security threat that exploits the trust users place in wireless networks, and that they can exist even inside seemingly secure buildings like offices or schools. The defense against rogue access points includes network monitoring tools that detect unauthorized access points, using only secured networks with proper authentication protocols, and critically always using encrypted connections like HTTPS and VPNs, so that even if someone intercepts your data through a rogue AP, they can't read it. Notice again how this ties back to encryption as a separate but complementary layer of protection. Packet sniffing, eavesdropping on the digital highway. If the internet is a highway, then data packets are the trucks driving on it. Packet sniffing, also called network eavesdropping or a passive attack, is the practice of intercepting and logging those packets as they travel across a network. A packet sniffer can be a legitimate diagnostic tool used by network administrators to troubleshoot problems, but in the wrong hands, it becomes a powerful weapon for stealing information. Here's what makes packet sniffing particularly insidious. It's passive. The attacker isn't breaking down your door, they're just quietly watching traffic go by, which means it can be very difficult to detect. On an unencrypted network, a packet sniffer can capture usernames, passwords, credit card numbers, and entire message contents in plain text. The College Board wants you to recognize that packet sniffing is most dangerous on shared networks, particularly public Wi-Fi, because on those networks, packets from many users travel through the same infrastructure. The primary defense against packet sniffing is encryption. When data is encrypted using protocols like TLS or a VPN, a sniffer might capture the packets, but the contents look like scrambled nonsense without the decryption key. This is a classic AP exam connection point. Encryption, covered in Unit 2 and Unit 5, directly defends against packet sniffing and rogue access point threats. Redundancy, keeping the network alive. Security isn't just about keeping attackers out, it's also about staying up and running when things go wrong. Redundancy in networking means building in backup systems and multiple pathways so that if one component fails, traffic can reroute and the network keeps functioning. Think of redundancy like having 2 power cords plugged into your laptop instead of 1. If one gets yanked out, you're still running. The internet was actually designed with redundancy as a core feature. Packet switching, the method by which data is broken into packets and routed independently across a network, allows packets to take different paths to the same destination. If a router goes down, packets reroute around it. This fault-tolerant design means the internet can withstand partial failures, whether from equipment malfunctions or even cyber attacks. The AP exam frequently asks about this in the context of why the internet is considered robust and decentralized, which connects directly back to Unit 5's broader discussion of how the internet was architected. Exam traps and connections to watch for. A few final things to tattoo on your brain before exam day. First, firewalls filter traffic, but do not encrypt it. If a question asks what protects data in transit from being read, the answer is encryption, not a firewall. Second, redundancy is about availability and fault tolerance, not privacy or authentication. Don't confuse it with security protocols. Third, rogue access points and packet sniffing are both threats that can be mitigated by encryption, which is why the AP exam often pairs these concepts together. And finally, remember that no single security measure is a silver bullet. The College Board emphasizes that effective network security requires multiple layers of protection working together. These concepts also tie beautifully into the AP exam's broader themes about the trade-offs of the Internet's open design. The same architectural choices that make the Internet resilient and accessible also create vulnerabilities that require ongoing vigilance to manage. With that foundation in place, you're ready to zoom out even further. Next up, we'll examine how computing has reshaped society, privacy, and civil liberties in ways that go far beyond the technical, touching on the deeply human questions the Internet was never designed to answer. 5.14 Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning Impacts. What is AI, really? Let's start with something College Board wants you to understand at a foundational level. Artificial intelligence is not magic, and it's not a human brain in a box. AI refers to the simulation of human-like problem-solving or decision-making by a computer system. The key phrase the AP exam uses is that AI systems work through the use of algorithms, and you already know from Unit 3 that algorithms are just step-by-step processes. What makes AI special is how those algorithms are built, rather than a programmer writing every rule by hand. Many AI systems use machine learning, where the system learns patterns from data. Think of it this way. Instead of teaching a child every possible dog photo by saying 4 legs, fur, floppy ears, you just show them thousands of pictures labeled dog and not dog until they figure out the pattern themselves. That's machine learning in a nutshell. Machine learning and training data. Here's where it gets critical for your exam. Machine learning systems are trained on large data sets, and the quality of that data directly determines the quality of the system's outputs. College Board is very specific about this. If the training data is biased, incomplete, or unrepresentative, the AI will reflect those flaws. This is not a minor technical footnote. It's a major theme you'll see in both MCQs and FRQs. Imagine you're building a hiring algorithm trained only on resumes from people who were hired at a company over the past 20 years. If that company historically hired mostly men for technical roles, your algorithm will learn that men are better candidates. It didn't choose to be sexist, it learned from biased data. The AP exam loves this kind of scenario. When you see a question asking what happens when an AI is trained on historical data that reflects past discrimination, the answer is always that the system will perpetuate and potentially amplify that discrimination. That's your anchor concept here. The two types of machine learning you must know. For the AP exam, you need to understand the difference between supervised and unsupervised learning, and College Board uses both terms. In supervised learning, the training data is labeled. Each example comes with the correct answer already attached. The dog photo example above is supervised learning. In unsupervised learning, the data has no labels, and the algorithm finds its own patterns and groupings. Think of a streaming service grouping listeners into clusters by music taste without anyone defining the clusters in advance. The system discovers structure on its own. A common MCQ trap is assuming all machine learning requires labeled data. Unsupervised learning does not, and that's precisely what makes it useful when you have enormous datasets that humans can't manually label. Impacts: the beneficial and the problematic. College Board frames this entire section around the dual nature of AI and machine learning. These technologies create both benefits and harms, often simultaneously. On the benefit side, machine learning enables medical diagnoses that catch cancers earlier than human radiologists, powers language translation tools that break down global communication barriers, and drives accessibility features like real-time captioning that transform lives for deaf users. These are concrete examples worth keeping in your mental toolbox for FRQs, asking you to describe beneficial uses on the harm side, and this is where the exam really drills you. You have issues of bias, privacy, economic displacement, and accountability. Let's unpack each one briefly. Bias you already understand from the hiring algorithm example. Privacy is violated when AI systems are trained on personal data without informed consent, or when facial recognition is used to track individuals in public spaces without their knowledge. Economic displacement refers to the way automation powered by AI can eliminate entire job categories. Think about how self-checkout machines and warehouse robots have changed the labor market, and accountability is arguably the trickiest. When an AI system makes a harmful decision, who is responsible? The programmer? The company? The user? The exam doesn't expect you to solve this philosophically, but you must recognize it as a genuine open problem in computing ethics. Algorithmic bias and feedback loops. One edge case that appears on MCQs more than you might expect is the concept of a feedback loop in biased AI systems. Here's how it works. A biased system makes biased decisions, those decisions generate new data, and the new data is used to retrain the system, reinforcing the original bias. Picture a predictive policing algorithm that flags certain neighborhoods as high crime. More police are sent there. More arrests happen there, and now the new training data confirms the original prediction. The bias doesn't just persist, it deepens. When a question asks whether using an AI system's outputs as future training data will correct or worsen existing bias, the answer is worsen unless the bias is actively identified and corrected first. Connections to other units. You should see this topic as the ethical and societal lens placed over everything you've learned in Units 2, 3, and 4. The data concepts from Unit 2, how data is collected, stored, and processed, directly feed into understanding what training data is and why its quality matters. The algorithm concepts from Unit 3 explain how machine learning systems actually function. And the Internet and privacy concerns from Unit 4 connect to questions about where AI training data comes from and whether it was ethically sourced. On FRQs, asking about the impacts of a computing innovation. AI and machine learning are perhaps the richest examples you can draw on, so having specific, concrete scenarios ready will dramatically improve your score. The FRQ scoring trap to avoid. Here's the most common mistake students make on FRQ questions about AI impacts. They give vague, generic answers. Saying AI can be harmful to society earns you nothing. You need to name a specific harm, explain the mechanism by which it occurs, and ideally connect it to a specific stakeholder who is affected. For example, a machine learning hiring tool trained on historical data from a company that previously discriminated against women may continue to rank female applicants lower, causing harm to qualified candidates who are unfairly rejected. That's a complete scorable answer. Practice building that structure, specific technology, specific mechanism, specific affected party. One more concept: overfitting. While it's tested less frequently, you should know the concept of overfitting, which occurs when an AI model is trained so specifically on its training data that it performs poorly on new, unseen data. It's like studying only the exact practice exam questions and failing when the real test uses slightly different wording. Overfitting is why diverse, representative training data matters. A model needs enough variety to generalize, not just memorize. As we move into the broader ethical and social implications of computing in the sections ahead, you'll find that the themes you've internalized here, bias, accountability, unintended consequences, and the dual nature of innovation, become the organizing framework for almost every topic that follows. 5.15 Automation and effects on employment. Let's talk about something that affects every single person sitting in that exam room with you, and honestly, every person alive right now, the way computing and automation are reshaping the very nature of work. This topic sits right at the heart of Unit 5's big idea, which is that computing innovations have real, complex effects on society, and the AP exam absolutely loves to test whether you can think critically about those effects rather than just recite platitudes. The core concept, what automation actually means. Start with the definition College Board wants you to use precisely. Automation refers to the use of machines, control systems, and information technologies to take over tasks that were previously performed by humans. Notice that word, previously. Automation isn't just about robots building cars. It's about any shift where computing takes over human cognitive or physical labor. A spell checker automates proofreading. A recommendation algorithm automates the work a music store clerk used to do when they said, "Oh, you like that band? Try this one." Keeping that broad definition in your head will help you on multiple choice questions that try to trick you with narrow examples. Displacement versus creation, the two-sided coin. Here's where the AP exam really wants to see nuance, and here's where most students lose points by being one-sided. Automation does two things simultaneously. It displaces existing jobs and it creates new ones. Think of it like a river that erodes one bank while depositing sediment on the other. The displacement side is intuitive. When ATMs became widespread, the number of bank tellers who handled cash transactions declined. When self-checkout kiosks arrived, some cashier positions disappeared. When agricultural machinery became sophisticated enough to harvest entire fields, the demand for manual harvesting labor dropped sharply. College Board calls this job displacement, existing roles being eliminated or significantly reduced because a computing system can perform those tasks more efficiently or cheaply. But here's the part students consistently underemphasize: automation simultaneously creates entirely new categories of work. ATMs required engineers to build them, technicians to maintain them, programmers to write their software, and security specialists to protect them. Every new automated system spawns a supporting ecosystem of human labor. The AP exam will often present scenarios and ask you to identify both effects, and if you only identify one, you're leaving points on the table. The skills gap. Why it's not a simple trade. Now, here's the subtle, exam-critical distinction you need to hold on to. Displacement and creation don't cancel each other out neatly, because the skills required for the new jobs are often completely different from the skills held by the displaced workers. A factory worker whose assembly line job was automated doesn't automatically become qualified to program the robot that replaced them. This mismatch is what economists call a skills gap, and College Board wants you to recognize it as a genuine and serious consequence of automation, not something that resolves itself automatically. Think of it this way. Imagine you were an expert typesetter in the 1970s, someone who physically arranged metal letters to print newspapers, desktop publishing software automated your entire craft practically overnight. The software created jobs for graphic designers and layout artists, but those required entirely different training and background. You weren't simply transferred to the new role. The exam might ask you to evaluate the claim that automation always creates as many jobs as it eliminates, and the correct answer is that while it often creates new employment opportunities, it does not guarantee equivalent opportunity for the specific workers who were displaced. Amplifying human capability, the collaboration model. Not all automation eliminates human roles. Some of it amplifies them. This is a critical distinction the AP exam tests directly. When a radiologist uses AI-assisted imaging software to detect tumors, the radiologist hasn't been replaced. Their diagnostic capability has been extended. They can now review more scans with greater accuracy. When a financial analyst uses algorithmic tools to process market data, they can make more informed decisions faster. College Board refers to this kind of relationship as automation enhancing or augmenting human work, and you should be able to identify examples of each category, replacement automation versus augmentation automation, in any scenario they present you. Efficiency, productivity, and economic effects. Here's another layer the exam tests: the macroeconomic ripple effects of automation. When automation increases productivity, meaning the same amount of human labor produces more output, prices for goods and services can fall, which benefits consumers. Think about how dramatically the cost of computing power itself has fallen because of automation in chip manufacturing. That's not abstract. That's why you have a powerful smartphone instead of needing a room-sized computer. However, if productivity gains are concentrated in ways that primarily benefit the owners of automated systems rather than the workers whose jobs changed, automation can also contribute to economic inequality. The AP exam won't ask you to take a political position on this, but it absolutely will ask you to recognize it as a legitimate societal concern and to distinguish between automation is always good and automation has complex effects that require careful consideration. Common MCQ traps to avoid. The exam loves two specific traps here. First, watch for answer choices that say automation eliminates employment in an absolute sense. That's an overstatement. Automation changes the nature and distribution of employment, but it doesn't eliminate it entirely. Second, watch for answers that say automation is purely beneficial with no drawbacks. College Board always rewards answers that acknowledge complexity and trade-offs, not simple celebrations of technology. Another trap: confusing efficiency with equity. An automated system can be highly efficient, doing tasks faster and cheaper, while simultaneously creating inequitable outcomes, concentrating the benefits among a small group. These are separate dimensions, and the exam will test whether you can distinguish them. Connections to other units. This topic connects beautifully to several other parts of the course. The discussion of beneficial and harmful effects of computing in Section 5.1 is directly relevant. Automation is one of the clearest real-world examples of technology that is simultaneously beneficial and potentially harmful. The topic of data and privacy in Unit 5 connects here, too, because many automated systems rely on massive data collection about human behavior and preferences. And think back to the concept of algorithms in Unit 3. Automation is built on algorithms, so understanding what algorithms can and cannot do well helps you reason about what kinds of tasks are most susceptible to automation. Bringing it together. When you see a question about automation on the exam, slow down and ask yourself, is this scenario about displacement, creation, augmentation, or some combination? Is the effect being described as certain or complex? Does the answer choice acknowledge both benefits and concerns? Those three questions will steer you toward the highest scoring responses every time. With automation reshaping the economic landscape, it's only natural to ask who gets to make decisions about how these technologies are developed and deployed, which leads us perfectly into our next discussion of the legal, ethical, and privacy considerations that computing innovations raise for individuals and society. 5.16 Environmental impact of computing. Why? Your laptop affects the planet. Let's start with a thought experiment. Right now, if you're listening to this on a phone or a laptop, that device is consuming electricity. The server streaming this audio is consuming electricity. The network infrastructure routing the data between us consuming electricity. Now multiply that by the billions of devices active at any given moment across the planet, and you begin to see why the College Board dedicated an entire learning objective to the environmental impact of computing. This isn't a soft, feel-good topic tacked onto the end of the course. The AP exam absolutely tests this, and students who dismiss it as common sense are often the ones who miss the nuanced distinctions that separate a 3 from a 5. The core idea: computing has real physical costs. The fundamental concept here is deceptively simple. Computing systems require physical resources and physical infrastructure, and that infrastructure has measurable environmental consequences. The College Board wants you to understand this in both directions: the ways computing harms the environment and the ways computing can help address environmental problems. Think of it like a car. A car burns fuel, emits carbon dioxide, and requires roads and parking lots to be built. Those are costs, but that same car might be driving a doctor to a patient or transporting food to a community. Computing works the same way. It carries costs and benefits simultaneously, and the AP exam loves to ask you to weigh both sides with nuance, rather than declare computing simply good or bad. Energy consumption and carbon footprint. The biggest environmental cost of computing is energy consumption. Data centers, the massive warehouses full of servers that power everything from Google searches to streaming services to cloud storage, consume enormous amounts of electricity. According to estimates from around the time of your course materials, data centers globally account for roughly 1 to 2% of worldwide electricity consumption. That might sound small, but it's comparable to the entire aviation industry. When you upload a photo to the cloud or ask an AI assistant a question, somewhere a server rack is spinning up and drawing power. Here's the key vocabulary the AP exam uses. The energy footprint of a computing system refers to the total energy required to manufacture it, operate it, and eventually dispose of it. This is sometimes called a life cycle perspective, and it's important because students often think only about the electricity a device uses while running. But manufacturing a smartphone requires mining rare earth metals, running factories, and shipping components across the globe, all of which have carbon costs before you ever charge the battery for the first time. The College Board also wants you to know that not all electricity is equal. If a data center runs on renewable energy like solar or wind, its carbon footprint is dramatically lower than one powered by coal. This is why some tech companies publicly commit to running on 100% renewable energy. It's not just marketing, it's a meaningful environmental distinction. Electronic waste, the hidden cost of innovation. Here's an analogy that tends to stick. Think of your tech devices like cut flowers. They're beautiful and useful when fresh, but they don't last forever, and when they're done, you have to deal with the remains. Electronic waste, or e-waste, is one of the fastest-growing waste streams on the planet. When devices become obsolete, which happens quickly given how rapidly computing technology advances, they often end up in landfills or are shipped to developing nations for informal recycling. The hazardous materials inside electronics, including lead, mercury, and cadmium, can leach into soil and groundwater when improperly disposed of. The AP exam won't ask you for specific chemical names, but it absolutely expects you to understand that manufacturing and disposing of computing devices has real environmental consequences beyond just running electricity. A common wrong answer trap on multiple choice questions is to assume that because a device has been turned off or discarded, its environmental impact has ended. It hasn't. The disposal phase is its own category of harm. Computing as an environmental solution. Now here's where the story gets more interesting, and where the exam really tests your ability to hold two ideas at once. Computing is also one of our most powerful tools for addressing environmental problems. Climate scientists use massive computing systems to model atmospheric changes and predict the effects of greenhouse gas emissions. Smart grid technology uses computing to optimize electricity distribution, reducing waste. Precision agriculture software helps farmers use exactly the right amount of water and fertilizer, dramatically cutting resource consumption compared to traditional methods. The key concept the College Board emphasizes here is that computing can enable more efficient use of resources. GPS and route optimization algorithms reduce the fuel consumed by delivery trucks. Machine learning models can identify energy inefficiencies in buildings. Remote work enabled entirely by computing infrastructure reduces commuter emissions, though of course it also increases home energy use. The exam loves to present you with scenarios like this where the answer isn't simply positive or negative, and asks you to identify which effects are benefits versus which are costs. The equity angle and common MCQ traps. One nuanced point that connects this topic to Unit 5's broader themes of digital divide and equity. The environmental costs of computing are not distributed evenly. E-waste disproportionately affects lower-income communities and countries. The communities hosting data centers or manufacturing facilities bear local environmental burdens, while the users of those services are often elsewhere. The AP exam may present a scenario asking you to evaluate whether a technology is beneficial overall, and the trap is to consider only the user's perspective without accounting for the communities bearing the environmental costs. Another classic MCQ trap is conflating reducing energy use with eliminating environmental impact. Even highly efficient systems still have a footprint. Efficiency improvements are meaningful and important. But the exam wants you to recognize they are improvements along a spectrum, not solutions that bring impact to zero. Connections to other units. This topic connects directly to the digital divide discussions in Unit 5 and to the data and analysis themes in Unit 2, where you learned how computing can process environmental sensor data. It also ties into the broader Unit 5 theme that every computing innovation involves tradeoffs, a concept that threads through the entire course from algorithm design to legal and ethical considerations. When you see a free response question asking you to describe a beneficial and a harmful effect of some technology, this environmental lens is one of the most reliable frameworks you can apply. As you think about the tensions between technological progress and environmental responsibility, hold on to this image. Computing is a tool, and like all tools, its impact depends on how we choose to wield it. That nuanced, two-sided thinking is exactly what the AP exam rewards. Speaking of how we make decisions with powerful tools, let's move into the ways humans interact with data and consider the ethical dimensions of data collection and privacy, which is where we're headed next. 5.17 Accessibility and Inclusive Design. Let's talk about something that might seem straightforward on the surface but carries real depth on the AP exam. Accessibility and inclusive design in computing. Picture this. You've built what you think is a brilliant app. The interface is sleek, the animations are smooth, and your friends love it. But then someone who is visually impaired tries to use it, and suddenly your masterpiece is a locked door. That's the problem accessibility is meant to solve. And the College Board wants you to understand both the why and the how at a conceptual level. What accessibility actually means. Accessibility in computing refers to the design of hardware, software, and digital content, so that people with disabilities or varying abilities can use it effectively. This isn't a niche concern. The World Health Organization estimates that over 1 billion people worldwide live with some form of disability. When you design without accessibility in mind, you're not just being careless, you're actively excluding a massive portion of potential users. The College Board frames this through the lens of inclusive design, which is a broader philosophy. Rather than retrofitting a product for different users after the fact, you build with diverse users in mind from the beginning. Think of the curb cuts you see at every street corner. Those sloped ramps were designed for wheelchair users, but they also help people with strollers, skateboarders, and delivery workers hauling heavy carts. That's the magic of inclusive design. Solutions built for people with disabilities often improve the experience for everyone. On the exam, this principle is sometimes called the curb cut effect, and it's a concept worth internalizing deeply. Types of barriers and accommodations. For the AP exam, you need to understand the different categories of disabilities and the computing accommodations that address them. Visual impairments are addressed through screen readers, software that converts text and interface elements into spoken audio, as well as high contrast modes, scalable font sizes, and alternative text, often called alt text, for images. Alt text is a written description embedded in the code of a web page that a screen reader can interpret and speak aloud, allowing a visually impaired user to understand what an image depicts. Hearing impairments are addressed through captions and transcripts for audio and video content. Motor impairments, difficulty using a mouse or keyboard, are addressed through voice control software, keyboard-only navigation, and switch access devices. Cognitive disabilities are addressed through simplified interfaces, consistent navigation, plain language, and avoiding elements that flash rapidly, which also helps people with photosensitive epilepsy. The exam loves to test whether you understand that accessibility features are not separate add-ons, but integral parts of the design process. A common MCQ trap is presenting a scenario where a developer adds accessibility features after building a product and asking whether this reflects inclusive design. The answer is that it reflects accessibility effort, but it doesn't reflect the philosophy of inclusive design, which would have incorporated those needs from the start. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. You may see references to accessibility standards on the exam. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, known as WCAG, are the internationally recognized standards for making digital content accessible. The College Board doesn't require you to memorize specific WCAG version numbers or technical criteria, but you should understand that standards exist and that they provide a framework for evaluating whether digital content is accessible. Knowing that structured, widely adopted guidelines drive accessibility compliance is the conceptual point you need. Connections to other units. Here's where this topic becomes richer on the exam. Accessibility and inclusive design don't exist in isolation. They connect directly to the broader themes of Unit 5, particularly the discussions of the Digital Divide 5.2 and the effects of computing on society. The digital divide describes the gap between those who have access to digital technologies and those who do not, and disability is one of the many factors that contribute to that gap. When software is inaccessible, it reinforces the digital divide for people with disabilities, even if they technically have a device and an internet connection. This also connects to the concept of bias in computing systems. When designers fail to test their products with diverse users, including people with disabilities, people from different cultural backgrounds, or people using different devices, they embed their own limited perspective into the product. The result is a system that works well for some and poorly for others, which is a form of unintentional bias. The College Board wants you to see that the absence of inclusive design is not neutral. It has real-world consequences for real people. Think also about the unit on data and the Internet. Accessible design matters for how data is structured and presented. Captions, for instance, don't just help deaf users, they create a text record of spoken content that makes it searchable and indexable by algorithms. Accessibility and functionality reinforce each other. Common exam traps to watch for. One of the most reliable MCQ traps in this section involves confusing usability with accessibility. Usability is about how easy and pleasant a system is to use for the general population. Accessibility is specifically about ensuring people with disabilities can use it. A product can be highly usable and still completely inaccessible on an MCQ. If the question is about ensuring a deaf user can follow a video tutorial, the correct answer will involve captions or a transcript, not simply making the interface cleaner or simpler, which are usability improvements. Another trap. The exam may describe a feature and ask whether it promotes accessibility. Remember that features like voice commands, keyboard shortcuts, and resizable text serve accessibility purposes even if many non-disabled users also enjoy them. Don't be fooled into thinking a feature isn't an accessibility feature just because it has broad appeal. For FRQ responses, when the prompt asks you to discuss how a computing innovation could be made more inclusive, the scoring rubric will typically reward you for naming a specific barrier, e.g., visual impairment, motor impairment, identifying a specific computing accommodation, e.g., screen reader compatibility, voice navigation, and explaining how that accommodation addresses the barrier. Vague answers like, make it more accessible for everyone, will not earn full credit. Be specific, be concrete, and connect the accommodation to the population it serves. Why this matters beyond the exam. There's something genuinely important happening in this topic that goes beyond test prep. Computing has become the infrastructure of modern life. Jobs, healthcare, education, civic participation all increasingly require digital access. When developers and designers treat accessibility as optional, they're deciding, often unconsciously, that some people's participation in society matters less. Inclusive design is fundamentally an ethical commitment to building a world where technology serves everyone. The AP exam reflects that this is not just a technical question, but a human one. And that's exactly the kind of thinking that will serve you well both on exam day and in any career that touches technology. As we move forward, you'll see how these ethical considerations surrounding design and equity tie directly into the broader questions of who benefits from computing innovations and who gets left behind, which brings us right into our next conversation about the global impacts of computing. 5.18 Innovation and the Internet's role in communication and collaboration. Let's talk about something you use every single day without thinking twice: the Internet. You sent a text this morning, maybe scrolled through a feed, possibly collaborated on a shared document with a classmate. All of that is the living, breathing proof of what this section is really about: how the Internet has fundamentally transformed the way human beings innovate, communicate, and work together. And yes, College Board absolutely loves asking about this on the AP exam, so let's make sure you own it. The Internet as a collaboration engine. Here's the core idea the AP exam wants you to internalize. The Internet is not just a tool for looking things up. It is a platform that enables collaboration among individuals, communities, and organizations across geographic, cultural, and socioeconomic boundaries. Think of it like this: before the Internet, if a scientist in Tokyo and a researcher in Brazil wanted to collaborate on a paper, they were looking at months of mailed drafts, expensive international phone calls, and logistical nightmares. Today, they share a Google Doc, jump on a video call, and push changes to a shared repository, all in real time. The Internet collapsed distance, and that collapse has accelerated innovation at a pace the world has never seen before. College Board uses specific language here that you need to mirror on the exam. The Internet enables communication and collaboration across distances. It allows people to share ideas, co-create solutions, and contribute to projects regardless of where they are physically located. When you see a question asking about a benefit of the Internet in terms of innovation, the phrase "regardless of geographic location" is almost always part of the correct answer. Crowdsourcing and distributed innovation. Now let's layer on one of the most important concepts in this section: crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing is the practice of obtaining input, ideas, or content from a large number of people, typically via the Internet. The beauty of crowdsourcing is that it democratizes innovation. You don't need to be a PhD at a well-funded lab to contribute to scientific progress anymore. Citizen science projects like Galaxy Zoo, where ordinary people help classify galaxies from telescope images, are a perfect example. Thousands of non-experts collectively do the work that would take a handful of scientists years to complete. Here's how College Board frames it. The Internet allows people to collaborate on large-scale problems by breaking them into smaller tasks that many people can work on simultaneously. This is sometimes called distributed problem solving, and it connects directly to concepts you've seen in earlier units about parallel and distributed computing. Remember Unit 4, where you learned that parallel processing breaks a big problem into smaller concurrent tasks? Crowdsourcing is essentially the human version of that. It's distributed human computation. Expect the AP exam to test whether you see that connection. Open source and collaborative development. Another pillar of this section is open source software. Open source means the source code of a program is made publicly available for anyone to view, modify, and distribute. Linux, the operating system that runs most of the world's web servers, was built this way. Thousands of developers around the globe contributing improvements over decades, none of them required to be in the same building or even on the same continent. Wikipedia works on the same principle for knowledge. These are examples of how the Internet enables collaborative creation at a scale that was simply impossible before. For the exam, know that open source development relies on the Internet to distribute code, receive contributions, track changes, and communicate among developers. The key benefit College Board highlights is that open collaboration can lead to more rapid innovation and improvement than closed, proprietary development alone. Communication technologies and their trade-offs. College Board also wants you to think critically about the communication technologies the Internet enables. Email, video conferencing, instant messaging, collaborative documents, social media. Each of these represents a different mode of Internet-enabled communication. The exam might ask you to distinguish between synchronous communication, where participants interact in real time like a video call, and asynchronous communication, where there's a time delay like email or a discussion board post. Both have legitimate uses, and neither is universally superior. A common MCQ trap is to assume synchronous communication is always better. But for a team spread across 12 time zones, asynchronous tools might be far more practical. You should also understand that these communication technologies have enabled new forms of community. Online forums, open source communities, and collaborative platforms have created groups of people with shared interests who might never have found each other in the physical world. College Board frames this positively as expanded access to diverse perspectives, which in turn fuels more creative and innovative outcomes. Potential downsides and the balanced view. Here's where the exam really tries to trip students up. It's not all sunshine. College Board wants you to hold a nuanced view. The same Internet that enables collaboration also enables the spread of misinformation, raises privacy concerns, and can create or amplify inequalities through what's called the digital divide. The digital divide refers to the gap between people who have access to modern Internet technologies and those who do not. This gap can be based on economic status, geographic location, age, or infrastructure availability. A student who only remembers the positives of Internet-enabled collaboration will miss questions that ask about limitations or challenges. Another nuance the exam tests: increased connectivity doesn't automatically mean increased equity of participation. Just because a tool exists globally doesn't mean everyone can use it equally. Watch for MCQ choices that conflate accessible via the Internet with equally accessible to all users. Those are not the same thing, and choosing the wrong one is one of the most common traps on this topic. Connections across the course. This section ties beautifully into several other topics you've studied. The concept of the Internet's underlying protocols, like HTTP and TCP/IP from Unit 4, is what makes all this collaboration technically possible. Without those agreed-upon communication standards, none of the tools we've described would function. Creative Commons licensing, which you saw in the context of intellectual property earlier in Unit 5, is directly relevant to open source and openly shared content online. And the broader theme of computing societal impact runs through this entire unit. Always ask yourself both who benefits and who might be left out or harmed. For your FRQ responses, if you're asked about the impact of the Internet on innovation or collaboration, structure your answer by giving a specific, concrete example, naming the precise benefit or challenge College Board's framework describes, and acknowledging trade-offs. Graders reward precision and balance. As you move into the next topic, you'll continue exploring how computing innovations shape society. Only now the lens shifts to the legal and ethical responsibilities that come with building and using these powerful tools. 5.19 Citizen Science and Distributed Computing Examples, Folding at Home, SETI. The big idea: harnessing the crowd. Imagine you have a puzzle so enormous that even the most powerful supercomputer in the world would take thousands of years to solve it alone. Now imagine you could break that puzzle into millions of tiny pieces and hand one to every person on the planet. Suddenly, what seemed impossible becomes achievable in days or weeks. That, in essence, is the beautiful idea behind citizen science and distributed computing. And it's one of the most compelling examples the AP exam uses to illustrate how computing can scale to tackle problems that matter deeply to humanity. The College Board wants you to understand that computing has fundamentally changed what kinds of problems humans can even attempt to solve. Distributed computing is the practice of connecting many individual computers over a network so they can work together on a single, large computational task. Each participating machine handles a small piece of the problem, sends its results back to a central server, and the pieces are assembled into a meaningful whole. The key insight for your exam is this: distributed computing enables solutions to problems that would be impossible or impractical for a single computer to solve in a reasonable time frame. That phrase, impossible or impractical, is almost exactly how College Board phrases it, so let it live in your memory. Folding at home. When protein chemistry meets your laptop. Let's talk about folding at home because it's one of the most famous and instructive examples you'll encounter. Here's the problem it solves. Proteins are the molecular machines that do almost everything in your body. They fight disease, carry oxygen, build muscle. But a protein only works correctly if it folds into exactly the right three-dimensional shape. When proteins misfold, you get diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and certain cancers. Scientists desperately want to simulate how proteins fold so they can design drugs to fix the problem. The catch? Simulating even a single protein folding event requires enormous computational power. We're talking about tracking the interactions of hundreds of thousands of atoms over incredibly tiny timescales. Enter folding at home. The project, run out of Stanford University, allows anyone with a computer to download a small client program. When your computer is idle, sitting there while you sleep, say it downloads a tiny chunk of the protein simulation, runs the calculations, and sends the results back. Your laptop contributed to curing disease while you were dreaming. For the AP exam, recognize that folding at home exemplifies how distributed computing democratizes scientific research. Instead of requiring a multi-million-dollar supercomputer, you leverage the collective idle processing power of millions of everyday machines. This is also a perfect example of how the Internet enables computing innovations that simply could not have existed before it. SETI at home, listening to the stars. SETI at home takes this same architecture and points it at the cosmos. SETI stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and the project run by UC Berkeley used radio telescopes to collect enormous amounts of data from space. The hypothesis was simple but profound. If intelligent life exists elsewhere in the universe, it might be broadcasting radio signals just as we do. The problem is that sifting through petabytes of radio telescope data looking for a non-random, potentially artificial signal is an almost incomprehensibly large computational task. SETI at home distributed that data analysis across millions of volunteer computers worldwide, each crunching a small slice of the sky's radio spectrum. Though SETI Home formally paused its distributed computing phase in 2020, transitioning to other analysis methods, it remains the canonical AP exam example of distributed computing for scientific discovery. What makes SETI Home particularly interesting conceptually is that it involves searching for a pattern in an enormous data set, a fundamentally different task from folding at home's simulation work, but solved with the same distributed architecture. For your exam, notice that both examples involve taking a problem that exceeds the capacity of any single system and decomposing it into parallel workloads that many computers can handle simultaneously. What the AP exam actually tests here is where you need to be precise, because this topic connects to several other concepts College Board cares about. First, understand the relationship between distributed computing and parallel computing. In parallel computing, multiple processors work simultaneously on subtasks of a problem, often within the same machine. Distributed computing does this across many separate machines connected by a network. The AP exam may try to blur this line, so be clear. Distributed computing is a form of parallel processing, but it operates at the scale of a network rather than a single device. Both approaches reduce the time it takes to solve large problems, but distributed computing uniquely leverages the Internet and geographically dispersed hardware. Second, citizen science is the broader concept here. Citizen science refers to scientific projects where members of the general public contribute to data collection, analysis, or processing, often facilitated by computing technology. Distributed computing is the mechanism that makes large-scale citizen science computationally feasible. The AP exam loves to ask about the societal and ethical dimensions of this. Citizen science expands access to scientific participation, can accelerate discovery dramatically, and represents a positive impact of computing on society. This directly ties to the overarching big idea of impacts of computing, a common MCQ trap you must avoid. The exam might ask whether distributed computing guarantees faster results than a single powerful computer. The correct nuanced answer is that it depends on the nature of the problem. Distributed computing is especially effective for problems that can be broken into independent subtasks, what computer scientists call embarrassingly parallel problems. If a problem requires each step to depend on the result of the previous step, sequential dependency, distributing it doesn't help much. Protein folding simulations and radio signal analysis can be nicely partitioned, which is why distributed computing works so well for them. If a problem cannot be parallelized, adding more computers provides no benefit. This is the edge case that trips up many students. Another connection to notice. These examples relate to Unit 2's discussion of the Internet as infrastructure, Unit 5's broader themes about computing societal impact, and the concept from earlier in Unit 5 that computing enables humans to solve problems at scales previously unimaginable. When you see a question about how the Internet has changed scientific research, citizen science projects are the perfect illustrative answer. Finally, remember the human dimension. Folding at home and SETI, how home are powerful because they transform passive computer owners into active contributors to human knowledge. College Board frames this as an example of computing, fostering collaboration and expanding scientific possibility, a genuinely positive development in a unit that also wrestles with computing's risks and challenges. With a firm grasp of how distributed computing harnesses collective power for good, you're perfectly positioned to explore the broader ethical and societal questions about computing's impact, which is exactly where we're headed next. 5.20 Undecidable Problems and Limits of Computing. The question that breaks computers. Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine you hand a brilliant programmer a challenge. Write a program that can look at any other program and tell you definitively whether that program will eventually stop running or whether it will loop forever. Simple enough idea, right? Just analyze the code and give me a yes or no. Here's the twist. It's been mathematically proven that such a program cannot exist. Not, it's really hard to write. It literally cannot exist, not on any computer, not with any amount of time or memory. That's the halting problem, and it's your entry point into one of the most fascinating and heavily tested ideas in all of computer science. Decidable versus undecidable, the core distinction. The College Board wants you to know the difference between two categories of problems, and the distinction is cleaner than you might think. A decidable problem is one for which an algorithm can always be written to produce a correct yes or no answer in a finite amount of time for every possible input. Most problems you've worked with are decidable. Is this number even? Does this list contain the value 7? Is this password at least 8 characters long? You write a procedure, it runs. It gives you an answer, done. An undecidable problem, by contrast, is one for which no algorithm can exist that correctly solves it for all possible inputs. Notice the precision of that phrasing. For all possible inputs. This is crucial. You might be able to write something that works sometimes, or even works for most cases, but there will always be some input that stumps it. The problem isn't that we haven't found the solution yet, it's that a solution cannot exist in principle. Think of it like this. Trying to solve an undecidable problem with a computer is like trying to use a ruler to measure the exact temperature of a cup of coffee. You're using the right general category of tool, measurement, but the instrument is fundamentally incapable of doing what you're asking. The halting problem up close. The halting problem is the canonical example the College Board uses, so let's make sure it's cemented in your mind. The problem asks, given any program and any input, will the program eventually halt or will it run forever? Computer scientist Alan Turing proved in 1936, before modern computers even existed, that no algorithm can solve this for every possible case. His proof uses a clever argument called a contradiction. Suppose you assume a magical halting checker program exists. You can construct a new program that does the opposite of whatever the halting checker predicts. Feed that new program to the halting checker, and you get a logical impossibility, a contradiction. Therefore, the original assumption must be false. The halting checker cannot exist. For the AP exam, you need to understand the conclusion more than the proof's mechanics. The halting problem is undecidable, meaning no algorithm can always correctly determine whether an arbitrary program halts, that always and arbitrary are doing heavy lifting, so don't let them slip past you. What undecidability does not mean. Here is the most common trap students fall into on multiple choice questions, so flag this in your memory right now. Undecidable does not mean impossible to answer in every specific case. You absolutely can write a program that checks whether some programs halt. If I hand you a program with a simple for loop that counts to 10, you can clearly see it halts. The problem is that no single algorithm can handle all programs correctly. The undecidability is about the general case, not every individual instance. Similarly, undecidable does not mean the problem is merely difficult or computationally expensive. Don't confuse it with problems that are hard to solve but solvable, like traveling salesmen or other problems you might see in algorithms discussions. Undecidable means provably impossible, period. Another trap, some students see undecidable and assume computers are broken or limited in an embarrassing way. Flip that perspective. Undecidability reveals something profound about the nature of logic and mathematics itself. It's actually one of the most elegant results in intellectual history. Limits of computing more broadly. The AP exam places the halting problem inside a larger conversation about the limits of computing, so zoom out for a moment. Computers are extraordinarily powerful, but they operate within real constraints. Some of these constraints are practical. A problem might be theoretically solvable, but require more time or memory than exists in the universe. These are sometimes called intractable problems. Others, like undecidable problems, are theoretical limits that no amount of hardware improvement can overcome. This connects directly to what you studied in Unit 4 on algorithms and complexity. Remember how some algorithms are efficient, polynomial time, while others are inefficient, exponential time. Undecidable problems take that a step further. They're not just slow, they're categorically off the table. When you see an exam question comparing these ideas, the key is to sort them correctly. Decidable problems have algorithms that always work. Undecidable problems have no such algorithm at all. Intractable problems have algorithms, but those algorithms are too slow to be practical. Connecting to other units. This topic has roots across the course in Unit 2. When you studied abstraction, you learned that computers work by representing information in layers. Undecidability reminds you that some questions about those layers are unanswerable by the very systems operating within them, a kind of built-in ceiling. In Unit 4's discussion of algorithm efficiency, you saw that solving problems sometimes costs more than we can afford in time or space. Undecidability says some problems cost infinitely more than that. And in Unit 5's broader impact discussions, undecidability matters for cybersecurity. It's related to why perfect virus detection software cannot exist. No algorithm can correctly identify every possible malicious program every single time, a real-world consequence of the halting problem. What to expect on exam day. Multiple-choice questions on this topic typically ask you to identify whether a described problem is decidable or undecidable, or to recognize correct statements about what algorithms can and cannot do. Watch for answer choices that say things like, a computer will eventually solve it given enough time. That's a trap, because undecidable means no algorithm solves it correctly for all inputs regardless of time. Free response questions might ask you to explain why a described approach to solving the halting problem fails, or to distinguish between two types of computational limits. Use precise College Board vocabulary, decidable, undecidable algorithm, and halting problem. Vague language costs points. The intellectual honesty of computing, its willingness to say this cannot be done, is actually a sign of strength, not weakness. And that mindset carries you beautifully into our next discussion of how the impact of computing shapes society, ethics, and the world beyond the machine. 5.21 Software Vulnerabilities and the Importance of Software Updates. Let's talk about something that affects every single device you've ever touched: your phone, your laptop, your school's network, even the ATM at the corner store. We're talking about software vulnerabilities, and trust me, this is one of those topics where understanding it deeply doesn't just help you ace the AP exam, it genuinely makes you a more informed person in a world that runs on code. What is a software vulnerability, really? Imagine you're building a house. You install locks on every door, alarm sensors on every window, and you feel pretty secure. But then someone discovers that if you push on a specific corner of the back wall in just the right way, the whole panel pops off, no key required. That gap in your security isn't the alarm's fault or the lock's fault. It's a flaw in the construction itself. That's exactly what a software vulnerability is. The College Board defines a software vulnerability as a flaw or weakness in a program that can be exploited by an attacker. Notice that word, exploited. The vulnerability is the gap. Exploitation is when someone actually uses that gap to do something harmful. You need to keep these two concepts distinct, because the AP exam absolutely loves to test whether you understand the difference between a vulnerability existing and an attack actually occurring. Software is written by humans, and humans make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are logic errors. The code does the wrong thing in a specific situation. Sometimes they're input validation failures. The program trusts whatever a user types without checking whether it's safe. Sometimes the flaw is in how the software interacts with the operating system or with other programs. Regardless of the source, the outcome is the same: a door in the wall that shouldn't be there. How vulnerabilities get discovered and exploited. Here's where it gets interesting and where the AP exam wants you to think carefully. Vulnerabilities can be discovered by two very different kinds of people. Security researchers, sometimes called ethical hackers or white hat hackers, look for flaws specifically so they can report them and get them fixed. Then there are malicious actors who look for the very same flaws to exploit them for personal gain, data theft, or disruption. When a vulnerability is discovered before the software developer knows about it, it's called a zero-day vulnerability. The name comes from the idea that the developer has had 0 days to fix it. They don't even know it exists yet. Zero-day vulnerabilities are particularly dangerous because there's no patch available, no defense that has been deployed. They're like a secret passage that only the attacker knows about. The AP exam may reference this concept, so keep it in your vocabulary. The role of software updates and patches. Now, here's the critical connection the College Board wants you to make. The primary way we address software vulnerabilities after they're discovered is through software updates, and specifically through patches. A patch is a software update designed specifically to fix a known vulnerability or bug. Think of it as the construction crew coming back to seal that secret panel in the wall. When developers learn about a vulnerability, whether from their own testing, from a security researcher, or sometimes, unfortunately, from an actual attack, they work to write a fix, test it, and release it as an update. This is why those little notification bubbles on your phone telling you to update your apps are not just annoying reminders. They are frequently closing security holes that, if left open, could allow an attacker access to your data or your device. The AP exam is very clear on this point. Installing software updates promptly is one of the most effective things an individual user can do to protect against known vulnerabilities. The moment a patch is released publicly, the vulnerability it fixes is also publicly known, which means attackers immediately know exactly what unpatched systems are now vulnerable to. This creates a race between users updating their software and attackers targeting those who haven't yet. Common attack types tied to vulnerabilities. The exam expects you to understand that software vulnerabilities are the entry point for many types of malicious attacks. Malware, including viruses, worms, ransomware, and spyware, often spreads by exploiting vulnerabilities in operating systems or applications. A worm, for example, doesn't need a user to click anything. It finds a vulnerability in software and uses it to copy itself from machine to machine automatically. This is distinct from a virus, which requires a user to execute an infected file. Phishing is slightly different. It's a social engineering attack that tricks a user into revealing information or installing malicious software. It doesn't always exploit a code-level vulnerability, but the installed malware from a successful phishing attack often then exploits software vulnerabilities to gain deeper system access. Knowing these distinctions matters on the AP exam. Common exam traps to avoid. There are a few places where students consistently lose points on this topic, and I want you to walk into the exam armed against them. First, do not confuse a vulnerability with an attack. A vulnerability is a potential weakness, and an attack is when that weakness is actively exploited. A system can have vulnerabilities and never be attacked, or it can be attacked in ways that don't rely on software vulnerabilities at all. Second, don't fall for the trap of thinking that software updates are only about adding new features. On the AP exam, when you see a scenario involving updates, your first instinct should be to consider security. Updates serve multiple purposes: new features, performance improvements, and security patches. But for this topic, security is the lens you apply. Third, remember that no software is perfectly secure. The AP exam may present scenarios suggesting that a system can be made completely safe. It cannot. The correct framework is risk reduction, not risk elimination. Managing vulnerabilities is an ongoing process, not a one-time fix. Connections to other units. This topic doesn't live in isolation. It connects directly to the discussion of cybersecurity throughout Unit 5, and it ties back to Unit 2's coverage of how the Internet and networks operate, because many software vulnerabilities are exploited over networks. It also connects to the broader concept of safe computing practices, which the College Board emphasizes as part of digital citizenship. When you think about encryption, also in Unit 5, remember that encryption protects data in transit, while software patches protect the programs handling that data. They work together as complementary layers of defense. Understanding software vulnerabilities also reinforces the Unit 5 theme that computing innovations, however beneficial, come with trade-offs. Every piece of software is a potential vulnerability surface, which is the price we pay for the incredible functionality that software brings to our lives. With vulnerabilities and updates firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to zoom out and think about how all these cybersecurity concepts, encryption, authentication, attacks, and defenses weave together into a complete picture of how we try to keep systems and data safe and inherently